polarization of the British people, pitching ethnicities and religious communities against each other. Don't get me wrong, I am not equating the UK with Hungary or Turkey, where liberal democracy has been eroded possibly beyond repair. I have hope that democracy in my country is resilient and civic education will keep immunizing people against the populist onslaught. But I'm asking you to be democracy has been eroded, mindful of the beginnings that too often lead down a slippery slope. With this, it is my great pleasure to hand over to our first panel, who will discuss the topics a little bit further, and I very much look forward to a lively, open and honest debate today and over the next day and a half. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irina, for opening the symposium for us. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists and guests. My name is Simon Watmo, and I'm a non-resident research fellow in the authoritarianism program at the ECPS. It's my great pleasure to moderate this first section of our symposium today, which includes our keynote speaker, followed by a short 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. The title of today's keynote is The Implications of Rising Multipolarity for Authoritarian Populist Governance, Multilateralism, and the Nature of New Globalization. Our distinguished keynote speaker is Dr. Barry Axford, Professor Emeritus in Political Science at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, where he was the founding director of the Centre for Global Politics, Economy and Society, and head of the Department of International Relations, Politics and Sociology. Dr. Axford has been a visiting scholar at universities worldwide, including UC Santa Barbara and the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara. He serves on the international editorial boards of the journals Globalizations and Telematics and Informatics, and he's honorary president of the Global Studies Association. Dr. Axford's books include The Global System, Theories of Globalization, The World-Making Power of New Media, and arguably for our theme over the next 2 days, most fittingly, his Populism versus the New Globalization, which was published with Sage in 2021. And I encourage everyone to pick up a copy. It's a lovely, slim introduction to the topic. I know we can expect a fascinating discussion as he unravels the complex ties between our populist moment and globalization. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barry Axford to our virtual stage. Dr. Axford, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good whatever time of day it is where you are. Reviewing the title for this talk, I'm reminded of the adage, don't bite off more than you can chew. There may be a danger of that in what follows. Nonetheless, I approach the task in good heart, I think, encouraged by the fact that the papers to be given in subsequent panels promise a greater degree of focus and thus round out my rather broad brush approach. So to start, here are a few bon mots on the theme of the symposium. They each tell a familiar story. The first is a quote from Gideon Rose in 2017, I think it was. He says, "Today the liberal international order is a bit dilapidated. The structure still stands, but paint is peeling, walls are cracking, and jerry-built additions jut out from odd angles. Even at its best, the arrangements never fully lived up to their ideals, and benefits have not always been distributed equally or fairly." My screen seems to have frozen here. So I'm looking for my second quote. The second bon mot is from EU Foreign Affairs Supremo Joseph Borrell in July 23, who said, "We live in a more and more multipolar world, but multilateralism is in retreat. It's a paradox. Why? Because when the number of participants in a game increases, the natural response should be to strengthen the rules governing the game. However, we are facing the opposite trend. The rules governing the world are running out of steam. We must find ways to overcome this paradox." The third bon mot is that regardless of what robust multilateralism might imply, or even require, as Donald Trump repeated a month or so ago, collective security, among other things, can go hang if America is expected to go on bearing undue financial costs. My fourth bon mot is from Elizabeth Broad's recent book, in which she claims the uprising of Europe's farmers is a final nail in the coffin of globalization. She goes on, now globalization is rapidly retreating, and the forces of populism it helped unleash are on the march. Finally, from the political platform in October of last year, a more swingeing judgment than all the others, I think, which says, for years we debated whether multipolarity would strengthen or weaken multilateralism. Now we know it has killed it. Now, with the exception of the political quote, none of these bon mots is a full-blown jeremiad on the twilight of the liberal order. Is Trump really serious about NATO? Does widespread agricultural protest actually signify a wider and deeper disenchantment with the globalized economy? Or even suggest that globalization is crumbling? Well, maybe. But at the very least, we're alerted to the complexity and dangerous messiness of world geopolitics and economics today, and this almost irrespective of where you stand on the rise or decline in American power. I'll begin by addressing the key terms in use. First, multilateralism, and particularly its troubled confrere, the liberal international order. Then multipolarity, which with something of an Orwellian cast can be read in different ways, and with quite different agendas in mind, I think. And finally, the part played by populism in these scenarios. All of this has to be couched, I think, in a rather wider canvas of what I've called the new globalization and the attendant shift to a re-racinated modernity and what that might entail for world order. So multilateralism first. This is rehearsing familiar ground, I think. The concept of liberal international order is far from precise, despite its routine use by scholars, journalists, and politicians. It is often spoken about as an open and rule-based order, enshrined in, and I'm quoting from John Eikenberry here, institutions such as the UN and norms such as multilateralism. States are core actors in this order, which nonetheless prescribes a cooperative demeanor on their part, and in some cases a partial abrogation or pooling of state power. But some definitional and thus, I think, operational issues arise. These include obvious qualifiers as to its actual openness. Is it really no more than a Western club masquerading as a universal order? What is meant by rules? Who makes them and what are the sources of their legitimacy? There's also the matter of what liberal implies. Does it reference a modal opposition to authoritarianism? Is it all about open markets and opposition to economic nationalism? Or is it just an abstract and scholarly term used to disparage realist and neo-realist theories of international relations? Well, as you might imagine, in fact, the concept melds all these definitions of liberal, but in doing so highlights tensions between them. These tensions are evident in what became known some years back, I recall, as the Beijing Consensus, whose precepts were succinctly put by Stefan Halper in 2012 when he wrote that states outside the West have been learning market economics with traditionally autocratic or semi-autocratic politics in a process that signals an intellectual rejection of the Western economic model. Here, economic and political liberalism are distinct, and one does not predicate the other. The present international order fuses two distinct notions. The first dates back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, somewhat contentiously taken to have laid down the concept of state sovereignty. The second draws on liberal thinking developed first in Britain and the US over the past 2 centuries. This version of liberal embraces, and I'm quoting Eikenberry again, open markets, international institutions, cooperative security, democratic community, progressive change, collective problem solving, shared sovereignty, and the rule of law. So what we currently depict as the international liberal order is in fact a hybrid based on more or less statist assumptions, and since 1945, a regard for multilateral cooperation in many policy areas and issues of common concern. In all but name, this is where the rub lies, in all but name, this was a settlement made in the image of the Western powers that initiated it. Realist in its commitment to state autonomy, it also espoused liberal principles and these found expression in the UN Charter. The great economic institutions of the post-war era, the GATT and then WTO, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, were resolutely liberal, but still dominated by Western powers and reflected Western economic interests. So the idea of a liberal international order comprises three basic elements. The first is a systemic configuration of power in the doctrine of sovereignty. The second is the architecture of fundamental rules and practices that designate sources of authority in that order and smooth its routine operation. Finally, there is the framework of social norms and that sanctions the other two elements. This third element provides a justification for what might otherwise appear as a system governed by contradictory imperatives, territorial particularism and moral universalism. These elements have developed in different and sometimes contradictory ways, and these are manifest in the tensions over an international security order, an international economic order, and an international human rights regime, all made under the auspices of a self-styled, benign American hegemony. Current arguments between the West and authoritarian powers such as China and Russia are not so much about international order per se, but about different versions of it, and in particular, about the way Western powers have sought to change it since the end of the Cold War. Russia, I suppose some startling appearances to the contrary, wants to go back to the order agreed at Yalta in 1945, in which states with different ideologies and political systems coexist, and in particular respect territorial sovereignty, a purely Westphalian world, in other words. In contrast, the more liberal order for which many in the West argued in the post-Cold War period demands that states be obedient to liberal principles in foreign policy, and I suppose in significant aspects of domestic policy too. What about multipolarity? At this point, it's appropriate to add that opposition to the liberal world order is not confined to China, Russia, and their allies. During Donald Trump's presidency, and still a feature of his current bid for office, is the rhetorical rejection of the post-war liberal order and America's stewardship of it. Moreover, it is clear that states of different hues do not share the vision of a benign US hegemony, or if they share it, wonder if the US is still suited to or committed to playing that role. In 2016, I think it was, Fu Ying, then chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Chinese National People's Congress, identified three features of what she called the US-led world order. These are the American value system, the US military alignment system, an international institute, sorry, I lost my page again, and international institutions, including the UN system. Although she didn't use the term hegemony, what she describes amounts to the same thing. Apparently willing to support the third element of the international order, she said that China would always temper its approval of a system based on Western and especially American values. This reaction is increasingly widespread and has led to demands to dismantle the post-war geopolitical order and inaugurate a more obviously multipolar world, just as has been realized in the economic sector. Americans counter, of course, that their hegemony has been and remains benevolent. But the fact is that many outside the geographic and ideological West, and some within it, including countries in Europe, see the liberal international order as an ideological project. China is still frequently mentioned as a possible or likely successor to American hegemony, and so attention rightly turns to the kind of world order it would support and pursue. Multipolarity is a defining feature of this order, and it elicits both approbation and opprobrium. Some commentators argue that it is a myth, and even those who discern its rise claim either that it can only ever be unbalanced and therefore dangerous, or that it meets a growing demand for sovereignty and identity and recognizes that there are multiple routes to economic modernity, especially in the global south. As Josep Borrell also said, this new multipolarity results from a combination of three dynamics. First, a wider distribution of wealth in the world. Second, the willingness of hitherto middle-ranking states to assert themselves strategically and ideologically. And third, the emergence of an increasingly transactional international system, seen in bilateral deals, strategic partnerships and the like, or in forms of minilateralism, rather than in global rules. Now, all this is a good way from the uniform end of history envisaged by Fukuyama in the early 90s, or visions of the smooth network world of hyperglobalist fantasy, and is clearly threatening to liberalism and universalism as the paradigm expressions of a post-ideological world. Moreover, the multipolar cast of 21st century globalization is significantly different from the 20th century version. Before coming to that, let me say a brief preliminary word about populism. The current and seemingly protracted spate of populism is also, I think, part of a post-triumphal post-hegemonic phase of global rebalancing. It is an expression of the tensions of the rise of globalization as a process of interconnection and debordering on the one hand, and strains of consciousness as well as pressing exigencies that resist any such convergence. It is at once fractal and ubiquitous. National populism is clearly orthogonal to the ideological landscape of the neoliberal narrative in the late 20th century globalization, with its borderless credo. Then it was fashionable, seemingly prescient, to declaim the potentially borderless quality of every kind of network and flow. Now that bullishness is largely absent in the global north as well as in the south. Populism, in its current guise, is a specific moment in the more encompassing dialectic of global convergence and heterogeneity, a dialectic that displays various types of accommodation between national and global imaginaries, while still proclaiming an ideological and an ontological divide between the two. The much rehearsed crisis of Western liberal capitalism is, along with the travails of Western modernity more generally construed, a staple in accounts of global change, leading to intense arguments about the end or rebirth of modern history. Sometimes this is glossed as a hegemonic shift, the sequential and even cyclical passing of preponderant might. But more often today, the emphasis is on systemic disruption, disjunction, and fragmentations, and on alternative futures, where nothing is certain and insecurity is rife. In terms of scholarship's attention to things global, this is an important development. For one thing, it locates the much touted backlash against globalization and modernity in a global crisis of existential security, which is a matter of consciousness, of course. In his well-known book, The Silent Revolution, published in 1947, when I was born, published in 1977, Ronald Inglehart drew attention to the extraordinarily high levels of existential security experienced in mature democracies in the decades following World War II. But for the past 40 years or so, citizens of even high-income countries have seen more volatility in fortunes, so that they no longer take material well-being or even survival for granted. As a result, the graph of tracing feelings of security has taken a marked downward turn. You will recall that Ulrich Beck argued that this is part of the crisis of second modernity, the inevitable consequence of living in the risk society. In risk society, hazards have become much more, or rather much less predictable than of yore, and even when predictable, profoundly more unmanageable. As a result, the scope for contingency, doubt, and relativism increases vastly, to the point where fears about survival are rife, all without the dampening effects of fatalism or the haven of insurance. In this scenario, the list of contributory ailments is familiar: declining real incomes, erosion of job security, rising income inequality within, if not always between nations, and fears for the lot of subsequent generations, not least in terms of actual or impending environmental and health disasters, and perceived threats from uncontrolled immigration and the displacement of whole peoples. Inglehart argued that the silent revolution dynamic is still at work, but to a marked extent, it has gone into reverse, with acute consequences both politically and socially. The consequences include growing support for xenophobic, populist, and authoritarian movements, along with a morbid fear of globalization, at least in its paradigmatic Western and capitalist, read neoliberal shape. In systemic language, this is something of a major point, I think. In systemic language, this suggests a faltering of the Western model of globalization and of Western modernity. Modernity shaped by rational cognitive reflexivity on the part of individuals and institutions, along with a critical monitoring of the self and social institutions by all actors. And as a reaction to the perceived failure of reflexive modernization and the ability to manage the trials of everyday life, there's been a search for, or sometimes a reversion to, seemingly more authentic and certainly more expressive components of self and collective identity. Anti-globalization and neo-statist rhetoric and activism is one such expression, distilled in the slogan, "Taking my country back." And it appears in various shades of contentious politics, not all of them regressive. And where it is not seen as part of a cyclical process, but as a contingency born of circumstance, deglobalization is another, often taking the form of what Nathan Betts called the innovative fortification of various enclaves and identities to protect against globalization's relativizing and integrative dynamics. Populism is a key, though not the only component in such politics. What are the implications for globalization's 21st century profile? The politics range from exclusivist forms of collective identity, like ultranationalism, through a world in which the other, however you conceive that, is forever consigned as alien and untrustworthy, to adopting designer selves in line with fashion or circumstance, making identity construction a lifestyle choice, almost postmodern, I suppose. Crucially for the temper of politics abroad in such a milieu, the latter often entails a rejection of meaning systems that are mediated by technical expertise, abstract systems, and rationality. Ironically, at a time when life itself is ever more subject to the pervasive technologies of the internet, AGI, artificial general intelligence, and soon quantum computing. The first two are all too familiar as the tools of what Joshua Neves calls under-globalization, with its panoply of fake news, deep fakes, conspiracy theories, disinformation, and polarized worldviews. On the ground, the search for security and for recognition has triggered new forms of contentious politics, as well as varieties of populism, new social movements of indigenous peoples, climate change protesters, communitarians, feminists, and trans activists have invoked elements of the romantic aesthetic tradition, but in its most robust and least palatable form, the search to minimize exposure to risk tribalizes relations between groups. In this scenario, the recently dominant trope of a hegemonic, benign, and borderless global order, capitalist, liberal, and embracing of cultural diversity, has less and less purchase. Other contenders, other globalizations, you might say, such as justice globalism or jihadist globalism, perhaps civilizationism, as well as evidence of multiple roots of modernity, point up the increasingly vociferous, or at any rate plural, qualities of the umbrella concept of globalization. The point is that all such changes in the real world demand an agile scholarship to address changing global complexity, which is comprised, inter alia, of the emergence of non-Western, post-Western, post-capitalist, and post-socialist globalities, and a myriad of global formations, including platforms in cyberspace. A sense of impending doom on many fronts lends a febrile quality to any discussion of global change and its direction, though the actual set of the world, after a veritable glut of deluge, remains hard to fathom. Which will undo us first? Nuclear Armageddon, courtesy of a throwback to what, pre-Ukraine, most scholarship had consigned as an outdated 20th century trope for world order? Or might demise lie in the kind of politics occasioned by excessive inequalities and growing precarities? In the spillover from the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and the weakening of US hegemony on many fronts, is climate change the obvious or only foremost in the apocalypse states? These are hardly frivolous questions, and for some they betoken a world already far down the road to perdition. So is there a new globalization? Neoliberal globalization is experiencing profound challenges, sometimes simplified, as I've said, as a backlash, and its opponents have markedly different prescriptions for the global future, including a world disaggregated into national redoubts. In the climate engendered by the coronavirus pandemic, the latter scenario is less a strategic vision of a multipolar or decentered globalization than the reflex of insecure humanity looking for succor where it can. The responses to COVID-19 reflect a sense of collective vulnerability while decanting to mainly local ways of dealing with it. And this, I think, is a paradigm for the present global condition. The same is true of the politics of climate change, where the course of national exceptionalism, seen in what became known as vaccine nationalism, was reflected in health security measures and in more draconian forms of immigration control. Viral and ecological disasters, along with the possibility of nuclear Armageddon aside, there is widespread agreement that liberal globalization has been usurped by rising protectionism and by divergent growth paths in emerging markets. Taken together, they describe a concatenation of crisis for previous versions of globality. But talk of a backlash against this model does not imply, I think, an end to globalization or even a systematic process of deglobalization. Rather, it posits a rebalancing in, although a destabilization of, what Steger and James described as taken for granted shibboleths, most obviously the centrality of unfettered markets. At this point, and sensible to the constraints of time, I advert three sets of factors which are remaking globalization, but without going into great detail. First, we should note a shift in the global balance of economic power, which is or may be of world historical significance. We're in the midst of another long-term transition from the Atlantic economy, Atlantic globalization, to the Pacific economy, Pacific globalization, a shift that further attests to globalization's dynamism and its indeterminate nature. This rebalancing is often characterized as a process of post-Westernization or Easternization. Using such labels is still simplifying. Sorry, my screen is jumping around in front of me here. But qualifies the urge to treat radical changes as just another increment in the cyclical transfer of hegemonic power. It is more accurately portrayed as a process of multipolar globalization, no longer enthralled to Western neoliberalism. Easternization is a complex process. Post-Westernization is a complex process wherein non-Western societies and civilizations acquire, institutionalize, and transform modern trade, as Casanova said in 2011. But crucially also enact their own versions of modernity out of their own pasts. The Chinese case underlines the fact that the pattern of global economic integration is not a Western telos, and in key respects never has been. So important questions have to be asked about the significance of events and trends and about the rise of emergent economies and fragmented societies more generally. Are these secular changes, heralding an epoch-ending terminal failure of the status quo, or another periodic readjustment in the dominance of global, read Western capitalism? Do they advance or retard neoliberalism, or is that question already redundant? Are they just another frisson in the changing, if not cyclical, fortunes of nations in general and preponderant nations in particular? Do they signify the advent of post-liberal globalization to core, as in a liberal and authoritarian state, China, and its cohorts make the running in terms of global growth and stewardship? More portentous, are the shifts epochal because they intimate the breakup of capitalist world economy, of capitalist modernity, and thus of capitalist history? The weight of these questions imparts a more nebulous quality to any judgments one might make about apparently seminal indicators of global change. The likelihood is that multipolar globalization has its own dynamics, including the lineages of Chinese and Indian economic development as alternatives to Western models of growth. But this is not another grand narrative of globalization, a new hegemony in the making, more a major rebalancing in key areas such as trade, finance, international institutions, and soft power. It contributes to a crisis of dominant modes and the appearance of a globalization that is more complex, overlapping, disjunctive, and disordered. My second indicator of what you might call new globalization is digitalization. I won't say very much about this. Of course, there are still robust signs of global convergence economically and culturally, but the drivers and character of that convergence are changing. And this has consequences for the character of world trade, for growth, as well as for wealth creation and distribution. Such drivers also impact profoundly on the ways we live our lives. Here I advert digitalization, the displacement of analog technologies and cultures by digital means, as a new global formation that has become, use Barry Sandoval's phrase, continuous and ubiquitous. In this respect, though in many others too, the emergent global, as Apadurai said recently, is or has been all about speed. While trading goods seems to be slowing down and maybe stagnating, trading global services and information, especially where they're digitally enabled, continues to boom. Of course, there are disabling pinch points in these developments. Digital technologies are not replacing mass and low-cost manufacturing altogether, or not yet. But the roboticization of production threatens an ever wider constituency of workers, not only low or unskilled operatives. The cultural and political need to protect jobs in face of such pressures is growing stronger, especially in advanced economies. And this spawns a protectionist politics to match. But here there is a critical prospect to consider. Across the board, maybe a more important prospect to consider, across the board, digital media are no longer just intermediaries between social agents, no longer just channels or conduits of information. Rather, they are generative social apparatuses that produce the social. Digital technologies are designed for a borderless world because, as Barry Sandoval argues, the images of life and nature and relationships they promulgate tend to take a universal form. Yet there are paradoxes here. Some of them apparent in the ruttedness of places and identities when set against the desire to live in the moment, to benefit from from simultaneity and routine access to digital means, and yet we feel the usual joys and trammels of human contact. Arguably, and I know it's arguably, these developments have few, if any, parallels in previous analog cultures. The virtual inscription to cyberspace are creating new spaces and times in politics, governance and leisure, new business practices and new kinds of imagined community. The changes are perhaps most advanced and dramatic in visual world, especially in the seductiveness and growing availability of worlds through virtual and augmented reality technologies and AGI. But in truth, they're everywhere, because digital information is accessible at any point on the planet, if not always easy, and thus supplies resources for personal and institutional innovation and greater reflexivity, and also opportunities for more systematic and draconian surveillance. This process is never going to be a tale of bland homogenization. The globalization of digital culture is variable and contested in terms of its liberating potential, its repressive and dehumanizing possibilities, and its variation across localities. And the digitalization of personal worlds and cultures demonstrates the same features, arouses the same passions. My third indicator of a new globalization is what I've called, and others have also called, sovereigntism. In a recent foray, Jonathan Friedman corrals populism's basic precepts with the label sovereigntism, an almost elemental regard for retaining or taking back control over one's conditions of existence, which is a mantra that keeps on giving. Witness the recently ex-British Prime Minister Liz Truss to the CPAC conference in the United States. In like vein, Paulo Gabaudo labels this phenomenon neo-statism. Sovereigntism is a very portable concept, and popular sovereigntism, the will of the people, is the evocation most favored by populists. Just where does all this sit in the narrative of a new globalization? Sovereignty resides center stage, if uneasily, in all accounts of modern globalization. And despite focus on the capacity and on the future capacity of the nation state and the international system of states, alongside a threat or promise of statelessness, sovereigntism looks back longingly to a more untrammeled version of sovereign power based on mutually exclusive territories and the retrenchment to the national dimension. If populism is the bully boy opponent of globalization, then sovereigntism and neo-statism are its intellectual and ideological avatars. They instantiate the innovative fortification of the national I spoke of earlier, but again, they do not amount to deglobalization. Most observers now agree that states are not in demise, which was the hyper-globalist conceit not all that long ago, in fact. But are they routinely effective actors, not just in the mythology of realist and neo-realist theory, but in their actual ability to penetrate, extract, and coordinate resources within a territorially defined space and act in concert with others? These resources include the size of the available pool of trust in governments and the belief that by and large they will do what they do will enhance the quality of life for citizens. The COVID-19 pandemic trialed the strength of that trust, challenging the state's position as a bastion for nationals while underlining its vulnerability to the indifferent globality of pathogens. But is this a limiting case, or was the pandemic a turning point in the capacity of individual states to manage their affairs, as well as in the shape of global geopolitics? But are there, I'm going to skip a short section continuing this theme and jump immediately to my conclusion. All this sounds pretty dour in many ways. Are there any reasons to be cheerful? Populism, which traffics the relativization and even transcendence of modernity's principles and forms, holds up a mirror to current politics and the current phase of globalization, and what that shows is both unedifying and palatable. But the vociferous quality of politics around the world should temper any impulse to generalize. This is the world manifesting different kinds of conflict and revolt, and that variety is itself a reflection of growing, not to say systemic, multipolarity. The decentredness or multi-centeredness of this world also qualifies any neat blanket label such as global capitalism, global neoliberalism, or liberal order, as unequivocal descriptions of a predominant or hegemonic variety of globalization or global system. Capitalism is differentiated and neoliberalism increasingly fails to convince as an overarching and steadfast rubric, because big players in emerging markets, China, India, and Northeast Asia, have developed and continue to develop outside it. And to underline further variety of origin and temper, Modi's populism in India is a mix of autocracy, ethno-religious nationalism and neoliberal economic dogma. Donald Trump, in his guise as the comeback kid, still beggars any model of ideological or policy consistency, touting a blend of Jacksonian conservatism and protectionism alongside neoliberal formulaics and now a developed white version of nationalism. It also remains true that in advanced economies in the West and North, populist movements and parties of both left and right have emerged in recent years to counter and protest the perceived and experienced ills of market capitalism. To a greater or lesser extent, and almost regardless of ideological hue, they offer cures or palliatives for perceived maladies that are inimical or at least challenging to democratic elitism as the dominant mode of governance and political culture. On this count, populism, in what I have elsewhere termed its postmodern guise, can be seen either as a distinct, though not singular, challenge to the remnants of embedded liberalism and the currency of its neoliberal spawn, or as a remedy for their ills. As Danny Roderick says, populism so conceived is part of an ideological and policy rebalancing of globalization. That said, it may be no more than a cathartic response to periodic crises, a shock to the system, rather than its successor in waiting. And that syncs with its hit and run style of politics. Populism appears to demand transformation, albeit of a back to the future variety, but is perennially light on detail. In the aftermath of COVID, such coltishness may continue to find favor with sections of disaffected electorates, but in the longer term, perhaps not. The spate of elections, including to the European Parliament around the world in 2024, may provide answers to that question. And to a great extent, that depends on how widespread the politics of anger and cultural insecurity is run. How serious is the demand for change in the battle to rebuild the world of domestic economies after successive crises? We know the depth of anger and the depth of and the degree of polarization, or so we now think, though many commentators dismiss such frustration as either whimsy and as an unlikely basis upon which to build a new politics, to fashion radical economic policies and to mend broken cultures. Better perhaps to fall back on what was tried and tested. Populism's credentials in these respects remain open to question. How committed are various electorates to radical solutions as opposed to garish gestures? And what would a politics born of such radical commitment look like? The cultural turn of late has encouraged citizens to repose what were once seen as biddable political issues into matters of identity that are not so malleable. And these may be legion. All this speaks, I think, to both pre-modern and postmodern definitions of the self and the collective, and is a profound data on the condition of modernity. So in the broader warp of things, and I'm very nearly at the close, what signifies is a politics founded on insecurity as the dominant motif for turbulent times? Crucially, insecurities are manifest over the stability of borders and identities as much as over jobs and wages. Of course, COVID-19 added a new source of universal insecurity. Populism did not cause these insecurities, but taking around it narrates a crisis of modernity that is unlikely to be resolved through mere refurbishment of usual politics. Because of that, it has a course still to run. Nonetheless, can it be redeemed as a project that tempers globalist successes, holds at bay the indifferent globalities of microbial infection, and heals cultural divisions? The answer is probably not, and certainly not entirely. But what I have begun to argue here, locates populism as a feature of a globalized world itself in the midst of change, and a quickener in the ontological shift away from political and quotidian modernity. Populism may not be an embedded feature of current geopolitics, but it is expressive of what is now a modal force for change, perhaps for good, more likely perhaps for ill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Axford, for that terrific talk to kick off our symposium over these days. Fantastic. You've given us plenty to ponder, and I'm sure we'll want to pick up quite a few of your points for further discussion. We've got time now, 10 minutes or so, for a brief Q&A, where the audience will have a chance to field your questions to Dr. Axford. What I suggest is that people who have a question use the raise hand function. To do so, select raise hand at the bottom of the application under the screen. By choosing this option, you can signal to us you have a question, and we'll then be able to bring you in. We ask you to keep your questions as brief as possible so we can hear from as many participants as possible before we move on. The other option is to put your questions in the chat so that I can pose them to Dr. Axford. Bulent asks, given the complexities and nuances surrounding the implications of rising multipolarity, how do you anticipate non-state actors, corporations, civil society, etc., influencing the interplay between authoritarian populist governance, multilateralism, and the global and the evolving nature of globalization, Dr. Axford?
That's a good question. I mean, hardly anything that I said there touched on that theme, and yet the whole question of non-state actors as a category and that rather more diffuse concept of global civil society, I think, is significant in, if not determining, then certainly influencing the sort of politics that go forward. I mean, it occurs to me, where do you place populism and populist movements and parties in that category? And whether you consider them to be a dynamic force for good or ill determines how you tend to view the contribution that can be made by non-state actors and by global civil society in the making of a new kind of global politics. My frank answer is I'm not sure. People talked about global civil society a great deal 10 years ago. You scarcely hear it now. Although I see that Barry Bazan has recently published, or is about to publish, a book wherein that concept is, in this context, is developed more fully. My own feeling, I think, irresolutely, at any rate, indeterminately, is that I'm not optimistic about an institutionalized role for non-state actors, other than big corporate entities like big tech. The temper of the world seems to be against that kind of intervention and the sort of playing field upon which global civil society operated following the 1990s upsurge in neoliberalism and so forth, is now quite different. Things are remarkably downbeat at present.
Thank you. I have a question which is tangentially related and kind of builds upon that question in your answer. I'm interested to know what role international organizations and multilateral institutions themselves might play in either addressing, I guess, or exacerbating the tensions between populism and globalization. I wonder, what do you think about that?
That's also a good question. I mean, I can see the force of it in respect of the role of institutions of governance and multilateral organizations in general terms as being backs to the wall at the moment, sort of riding a wave of neo-statist confidence and bullishness. I'm not sure whether that incorporates the populism element is opaque to me. What do you think? I've lost the video. I've lost the audio.
Simon, you are mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to suggest if you take the European institutions as an example, and Irina can speak far more fully to it than I can, but I think they're too timid to stake out a position, at least to defend. I mean, I think there's been some effort around policy-wise getting ahead of some of these issues, but it seems to me that the multilateral institutions are a bit hand-tied to act, at least in a mitigating role, I guess.
I think I would agree with that. And there's also I mean, curiously in terms of populism's appeal, that is, multilateral institutions and national governments are, generally speaking, in bad odor with people in general. There is a growing sense of, if not illegitimacy sufficient to cause a legitimation crisis in Habermas's sense, perhaps, and as a sense that these institutions are not valuable in creating a better world, however you want to interpret that. That makes it much more difficult to claim that you're acting on behalf of world society, global society, national constituencies. Yes, it fits more uneasily, but more truthfully, I think, in a description of world geopolitics at the moment that says it's, well, as our Foreign Affairs editor said in 2017, that it's ramshackle. The institutions are ramshackle, the reputation of the institutions are threadbare. There is considerable room, I think, for a crisis of legitimacy of these institutions in the next 20 years, which could prove disastrous.
Yes. I think we have time for one more question. So I see Irina has her hand up. I'd like to welcome you in your question.
Thank you, Simon. I really just wanted to quickly follow up on your question and Barry's answer to this earlier. And by the way, thank you so much, Barry, for this absolutely brilliant overview, really, over what is going on in the world. On multilateral institutions, having worked for the European Union, I think you're absolutely right. There is a crisis of legitimacy, and we have been trying to fight this not just from within as a pro-European politician, but I have been pointing this out in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, that populists in particular pointing to democratic deficit or so-called democratic deficit. I think that is a challenge. I think the international, particularly the supranational organizations such as the EU, need to do something about that and do urgently. Different maybe for the United Nations, which is lacking the enforcement arm for obvious reasons, therefore cannot act and has outmaneuvered itself, of course, with the veto in the Security Council. So I just wanted to give that brief comment. It wasn't a question, which I hope leaves open time for another question from someone else.
Thank you.
I think we do have time for one more question, and we have one submitted through the chat. Anna Ben Amara asks, do you think that the call for ideological rivalry will just remain a lesson from history, or will it be a second scenario that'll play out in the US-Chinese rivalry? What do you
I'm not sure that I'm competent to answer that question, but it could cut either way. Depends. I mean, if you take what's happening with the Ukraine crisis and intervention as the center point of that, and the potential for a similar conflagration in the Asia-Pacific region, then history is repeating itself. I'm always slightly worried about that kind of historical parallelism. There are too many nuances and variables which are context-specific for one to do that with any degree of certainty. But it's possible. There are elements of it, and certainly the rhetoric of it, as found in mainstream media and in some parts of the web, would suggest that that's the way it's being couched by a whole lot of people.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to take the liberty of pushing a little bit into the next panel and pull out one more question. So Ibrahim has asked, it appears that the current Western-centered multilateralism is not working or very legitimate. However, in the multiplex world that Acharya mentions in his publications, how will different states with various capacities, interests come together to create a global consensus in that transactional sense you mentioned through bargaining around contemporary challenges?
Well, the one in one sense would seem to preclude the other. I mean, I said at the beginning of my talk that multilateralism multipolarity is a sort of Orwellian concept in many ways. It depending on how you're using it and why you're using it, it can take on different meanings. So if you take the notion of multipolarity as signaling an opening up of the world to different kinds of political forces and interests and definitions of the world, then it could be construed as a good thing, as encouraging a more fluid cooperation. The reality, on the other hand, is that, or some of the reality at any rate, is that it seems to decant into a rather more narrowly conceived notion of strategic interest, visited through forms of minilateralism, through national partnership agreements of one sort or another. So it depends on the interpretation that you take, I think. My own feeling is that multilateralism is and has been too closely associated with Western interests to muster, for all its virtues in many respects, to muster as an appeal in what is now a much more fragmented and tendentious world.
Yes, I think that's right. We've gone past 2 o'clock, so that brings us to the end, sadly, of our opener. And so I'd like you all to join me in once again thanking Dr. Axford for his time today, for his brilliant lay of the global landscape, and setting us off for a terrific set of panels through today and indeed into tomorrow. And so with that, I will pass now over to the moderator of the first panel for today, Dr. Albena Asmanova. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Albena Asmanova. I'm professor of political and social science at the University of Kent. So I'm happy to convene this first panel, which will focus in on the interactions between multilateralism, multi-order world, and populism, the main topic of our conference here. So we have the two contributions. So there's a slight change of program. We have two contributions, first by Dr. Stuart Patrick, who is a senior fellow and director of the Global Order and Institutions program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And then we will hear from Dr. Victor Jakubec, who is honorary professor of international development at the Faculty of Art and Education, Deakin University in Australia. He is also a faculty member of the Economics and Social Sciences at Potsdam University in Germany. So I now give the floor to Stuart Patrick, who will address the topic. His paper is Reimagining Global Economic Governance and the State of the Global Governance.
Thank you very much, Professor Asmanova. I want to congratulate Irina von Wies and Ibrahim Öztürk and their colleagues for putting this together. It's a great collection of luminaries, and I very much enjoyed Barry Axford's wonderful overview. Really terrific, sir. So I'm honored to be in such esteemed company. I want to speak today a bit about the crisis of global neoliberalism and whether it's possible to imagine a new model of global economic governance that might be more just, resilient, and sustainable, and that also might deliver essential global public goods. And I would put it in the context of some of the major, of the broader crisis of world order that we're seeing. Obviously, we're living in a period of extraordinary turbulence that's caused many to reconsider some long-standing assumptions about the world economy. And over the last decade, we've seen growing, almost it's become conventional wisdom that neoliberal ideology that shaped and governed the world economy for many years has often failed to deliver prosperity, economic resilience, political stability, or environmental stewardship. And the shortcomings of hyperglobalization, and particularly the financialization of the world economy, are increasingly apparent. And the inadequacy of existing arrangements were obviously accentuated and exposed by a series of recent shocks, from the global financial crisis to COVID-19 to the resurgence of geopolitical conflict, the deepening climate crisis, and of course, the revolution in digital technology that Barry spoke about. And this actually opens some avenues conceivably for major institutional change, because as we know from history, crises of these sorts can loosen attachment to existing orthodoxies and have people look in other directions, as well as open the possibility for new political coalitions. So around the world, we've seen governments and publics seeking in their own ways to renegotiate the terms of their integration of the global economy, or protesting, perhaps particularly with respect to populism, existing arrangements. So the idea here is they want to chart their own course. They want to regain control, assert their sovereignty, as Barry mentioned, and they want to be able to pursue distinct preferences amongst these in the areas of social welfare, industrial policy, development priorities, environmental goals, and national security objectives. I think what's different compared to previous instances of objections to globalization is that much of the critique is coming from globalization's historic champions, not least in the United States. And I think there's also, though, an increase in accompanying conviction, at least at the global level, that the major institutions of global economic governance and the rules of the global economy are no longer fit for purpose. They don't reflect major shifts in power and demography, and they struggle to address global challenges that were hardly imagined when the existing foundations of many of these institutions were laid down. For instance, artificial intelligence or the governance of outer space, to just pick two examples. Pressure is also growing to transform the architecture of international cooperation so that it's more responsive to developing country needs, but there also obviously are tensions with many wealthy countries in terms of what that would look like. UN, it is quite striking that both the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and even the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, have called explicitly for, quote, a new Bretton Woods moment. And if you think about what the original Bretton Woods settlement entailed, this would be at least in some measure, an effort to restore the social bargain that was at the heart of the post-war global economic settlement, one that the late John Ruggie called the compromise of embedded liberalism. That compromise importantly left significant autonomy to national governments to pursue domestic purposes. But it's also clear that going back to the future isn't going to be enough because the global context is so different and the transnational and even planetary challenges that we confront now are more complicated. We need new rules and institutions for today's political economy. And we need a new narrative to help explain and legitimate this approach. This narrative also problematically needs to span nations that may agree that the current world economy is not working, but disagree on what ails it, much less the specific remedies. To further complicate matters, we face not only a crisis of neoliberalism, but as Barry mentioned, a crisis of multilateralism and indeed a crisis of the global order itself. Around the world, many governments and publics have lost faith in current frameworks of international cooperation, regarding them as alternatively or collectively incapable of delivering security and incapable of delivering prosperity and well-being, corrosive of national identity, illegitimate and unrepresentative in their government, unresponsive to new challenges, and lacking in accountability, as well as threatening of national sovereignty. So this obviously is a driving force. I'm not a major student of populism, although I have written a bunch on the nature of sovereignty and desires of taking back control. And I think this loss of faith of globalization is without question a driving force behind nationalist, populist, and often authoritarian politics that are the subject of this conference, which complicates efforts to revive multilateralism. So given these dynamics, is it actually realistic to imagine a more equitable and responsive globalization that can balance the realities of global pluralism and preference diversity with the imperative of at least some basic common rules and cross-border cooperation? And importantly, is it possible to conceive of a framework of global economic governance that gives more voice and weight to the global majority, as well as non-state stakeholders? And what would this look like? For would-be reformers, a core dilemma is how to reconcile the domestic and international sides of this equation by updating multilateral institutions that help mitigate the negative spillovers of national policy choices, cushion societies from systemic shocks like the ones we've found, and advance the interests of all countries and populations. So the question is, can we envision a new paradigm that respects diverse preferences, but also promotes adherence to shared rules? Before turning to that question and to some reasons why there actually is possibilities of being hopeful, I want to pull back a bit and address some of the concerning trends that we've seen. These calls to reform global economic governance are not occurring in a vacuum, but unfolding it in a context, as I mentioned, of a broader crisis of world order, which is fragmenting, undermining international cooperation at the precise moment that it's most needed, as Barry mentioned. Now, the phrase world order or global order is a bit bloodless. And so one has to be a little bit more specific as to what we're talking about. I mean, at a minimum, it implies a degree of predictability or pattern of regularity in interstate relations. Historically, all enduring international orders have relied not only on a stable power distribution, although one debates whether or not it's multipolar or hegemonic, but also on some basic consensus among nations, particularly the most important on certain principles of conduct. Such normative agreement helps temper the structural anarchy in a system of independent states. Now, it goes without saying that the quality, depth, and scope of world order has varied dramatically over time. For much of history, of course, world politics was governed by only a few basic rules of peaceful coexistence, and a truly global order as we know it today, based on the principle of sovereign equality, began to emerge only after the Second World War. Importantly, though, from our perspective, the post-war decades and what makes them distinctive is that we saw a remarkable proliferation of international organizations, frameworks, regimes, and treaties across virtually every global domain, a process that accelerated, at least initially, when the Cold War ended. And this lattice work of intergovernmental cooperation, complemented by transnational networks of non-governmental actors, has permitted an unprecedented, if still very uneven, degree of governance in world politics that one could argue was not there before. So we can actually speak of global governance where we couldn't really before. While no single country created this order, it shaped, obviously owed a great deal to the conscious effort by the United States and its closest partners to build an open world grounded in new multilateral institutions, one that they believed would be conducive to capitalism, to democracy, and collective defense. Again, needless to say, this was a deeply imperfect order, one redolent of imperial dynamics, particularly in the periphery. Nevertheless, the multilateral architecture that evolved was quantitatively and qualitatively different than anything that had come before. Now, one can debate whether or not this order, which its defenders term the liberal rules-based international order, was particularly liberal, was particularly rules-based, was particularly international, or was particularly orderly. And where one stands on all of those very much depends on where one sits around the globe. But regardless of the degree to which it lived up to its rhetoric and perhaps the more utopian narratives about what it consisted of, that order is clearly on the ropes. And its body blows include resurgent geopolitics and war, surging inequality, a planetary ecological emergency, a global demographic mismatch, disruptive technological trends, a global democratic recession, and a vacuum of leadership. And I'd like to go through those in a bit. But first, I want to highlight that the crisis of multilateralism in world order reflects not only competing material interests, that is, who is up and who's down, but often and increasingly fundamental divergences of world order visions, not least over the purposes that global governance should advance. That is, global governance for what? Nations often disagree on the principles, rules, and norms that should govern conduct in particular spheres. And this is a topic that I wrote about in quite a long Carnegie Endowment working paper called Rules of Order, Assessing the State of Global Governance. And it looks at the fact that these divergences, normative divergences, are pretty apparent, whether one's talking about foundational rules of political order like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the use of force, or rules for the global economy. For instance, the rules that should govern trade, finance, development, investment, and the like. It's also true for rules governing the global commons, as well as the Earth system when it comes to climate and biodiversity, as well as global health. It's true when one thinks about rapidly emerging digital technologies and other technologies, and also, and unsurprisingly, when it comes to the degree that one believes that principles of human rights and democracy should pervade or be part of global order. So I want to look at a few of the factors destabilizing and fragmenting the world order. The first and most obvious is that geopolitics and war are back. The end of the Cold War, of course, was a time of not only triumphalism but extraordinary optimism in much of the West, not least in the United States, of course, about democracy, globalization, and cooperation. And as recently as about a decade ago, President Barack Obama could declare that the era of great power competition was a thing of the past, and that international politics had become the management of shared challenges. Now, of course, neither Xi Jinping nor Vladimir Putin received that particular memo, not that they are solely to blame for the resurgence in geopolitics, but obviously East-West antagonism has resurged, most obviously in Ukraine, of course, and over the Taiwan Strait. The incidence of war is also up sharply. Steven Pinker may write about the better angels of our nature, but some of his, at least, writing about the obsolescence of war appeared to be a bit premature. Last year, there were over 180 armed conflicts around the world, and obviously the situation in Gaza being one of the most horrific. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council, partly as a result of this resurgence in geopolitics, is gridlocked in what Secretary General Guterres calls colossal global dysfunction. But it's the relations have also deteriorated clearly between wealthy nations and countries of the self-styled global South, who see the rich as indifferent to their needs and unwilling to make room at the global high table, and they have quite a bit of justification for that. Emerging powers like India and Brazil and others are not yet rule breakers, but they're clearly tired of being rule takers, and they want to be rule makers on issues from trade to climate. And this underscores an important point about the whole notion of a rules-based international order, which, Western policy makers and pundits have lamented the decline and the erosion of that order, but they've left a lot of tricky questions unanswered. Most importantly, what rules precisely are they talking about? Where did those come from? They didn't magically appear. How selectively have they been applied in the past, etc. So, as I mentioned, the crisis of world order is not simply with what powers are rising and which are declining within an agreed framework of rules. They're about they reflect normative disagreements about these. And this divergence suggests that the emerging order may be normatively thinner than it has been in the past. Danny Roderick and Steve Walt wrote a very interesting paper in an essay in Foreign Affairs, making precisely this point about a year and a half or 2 years ago, basically suggesting that we are facing a world in which global governance needs to aspire to less in some ways because of these normative differences. And so again, one could easily imagine some of the institutional profusion proliferation that I discussed, either fragmenting or becoming normatively thinner. The second major factor, obviously complicating international order, is that the backlash of globalization continues, and it's propelled by surging global inequality. Obviously, in the 1990s and into the century, many champions of globalization, hyperglobalization, believed that it would bind nations closer together, lift all boasts, and bolster solidarity. That has been buried by the global financial crisis, by US-China decoupling, COVID-19, and the aftershocks of Ukraine, among other issues. And many countries obviously are turning their back on free trade, free flow of capital, and embracing industrial policy. Obviously, surging economic inequality is a huge aspect of this. Many of the gains, certainly in the United States, levels of inequality have reached levels that you have not been seen since the Roaring '20s and threaten to bypass those. The big losers in this era have been the lower and middle classes in rich countries. The big winners are obviously the already wealthy and wealthy countries. And those levels of inequality are not only morally obscene, but a recipe for populism and instability. The third major shock is the continued fact that we face a global planetary emergency. We are, in effect, at war with the living planet, with the biosphere. Between 1990 and 2020, a lot of good things happened. The percent of people living in extreme poverty, for instance, at least by some measures, fell from 36% of all people in 1990 in the world to 9%. But much of this progress obviously came at nature's expense, and that bill is coming due. Humans, of course, are the biggest force shaping the Earth system from the atmosphere to the oceans. Every year, every month, we set new records. And have blown by already, at least for temporarily, at least, the Paris Agreement target of holding average global temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Oceans are warmer than in 100,000 years and 33% more acidic than they were just 200 years ago. And critical components of the Earth system are approaching dangerous tipping points. Biodiversity is also collapsing, jeopardizing the ecosystem services that we get, which, according to even the folks at Davos, the high priests of capitalism, they say that 1/2 of global GDP depends on benefits that we get from nature, benefits that we are in the process of destroying. The fourth challenge is what I would call a demographic mismatch. The world is both too old and too young, and we haven't really figured out how to address this imbalance. A year ago, as you know, a year and a half ago, humanity topped 8 billion for the first time, up from just 5.3 billion in 1990. But obviously, in the wealthy world, we worry much more about underpopulation. In Italy, the fertility rate is 1.23 births per woman, way below replacement. And in South Korea, it's an astonishing 0.84 per women. And so many aging countries, and I don't have to tell those living in Europe, face a fiscal cliff. They don't have enough workers to support pensioners living longer and thankfully healthier lives. Meanwhile, in Africa, the continent is going to see its population double by 2050, when 1 in every 4 people will be African. And that could be a boon if it can harness its demographic dividend. But will the world economy, and to say nothing of national governments, deliver opportunities or more disappointment? Now, there's an obvious demographic solution to this demographic mismatch: higher migration from poor but youthful to richer but aging nations. But the politics of that are just totally toxic, particularly as they relate to undocumented arrivals. If I don't have to tell, again, those living in Europe, but also those who witness the sort of dramas going on the southern border of the United States. And again, that is fuel to the fire for populism. The fifth area, and here I'll pick up on some of Barry's comments, are new risks from technology. We obviously live in a Promethean age. We're in the midst of what Richard Danzig calls a technological tsunami. And, every day seems to be gee whiz advances, gee whiz advances from, AI to nanotech, synthetic biology to quantum computing, et cetera. And if this is leaving us breathless, it's also leaving governments in the dust. And that is a problem, because while these technologies can do amazing things, they also pose extraordinary risks, not least dual use risks. If you consider AI and biotech, they can be used to educate. The first can be used to educate or misinform. The latter can be to develop a vaccine or the latest superbug. I should note that 2 decades ago, it cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human genome. Today, the price is $600, and you can create new life forms in your garage. More to the point, for our purposes, recent advances in digital technologies in particular threaten massive dislocation in knowledge-based sectors that have heretofore been insulated from technological disruption. High-income workers are now facing at least the risk that low-skilled workers have been facing for decades. These developments, as was noted, are also entrenching the dominance of massive monopolistic private technology platforms that are amongst the most powerful companies the world has ever known, with an influence that exceeds most nation states. The sixth trend that I'll point to is a global retreat in democracy, and obviously the topic of this conference, a surge in populism, including of an authoritarian variety. The world is, by some measures, in the 17th year of a democratic recession that it has touched all corners of the globe and weakened support for sustained internationalism, to say nothing of global governance. In addition to the rise of partial democracies and anocracies, many of the biggest recent declines and challenges to democracy have occurred in established democracies, including both the world's largest, India, and the most powerful, the United States. The current technology ecosystem, including the simultaneous pervasiveness and splintering of media, has only reinforced the retreat from a common civil and political culture. It's also provided, of course, as was mentioned, authoritarian governments with unprecedented surveillance capabilities. So the prospects for international cooperation, including on global economic issues, will depend heavily on the outcomes of elections in this pivotal year. And the final factor that I'll mention here is the vacuum of leadership, including doubts about the future of American internationalism, and also whether the United States is actually open to a different style of leadership that is based less on fantasies of exceptionalism and more about the ability to become a quote unquote more normal power. Since 1945, the vigor of the multilateral system has obviously depended heavily on the United States, which helped to create and in many respects defend this system. American multilateralism has always been fraught, however. It's always been ambivalent and selective. And I've written a bit on that, including in my book, The Sovereignty Wars, Reconciling America with the World. But the Trump administration took that to new levels and marked the ascendancy of a hyper-nationalist, sovereigntist, protectionist, isolationist, and nativist regime that was a qualitative departure from decades of U.S. internationalism, as problematic as sometimes that was. And his reelection in November could herald the third 180-degree turn in U.S. foreign policy in only 8 years. I do want to note at least one ironic aspect of this, given that we're talking about the rejections of neoliberalism. Ironically, the greatest continuity between the Biden administration and the second Trump administration, however stylistically they would be different, could ironically be precisely in global economic policy. While again, the style would be highly different. We could well see a continuation of some elements, not least in industrial policy and skepticism of the WTO, for instance. Now, given this daunting global context, what are the prospects for forging a new narrative on global economic governance? I don't have any definitive answers, obviously, but just a few thoughts about ways to approach this challenge and some principles that should guide our efforts. I'll try to make this quick to get to our next speaker. First, we need to look at the lessons of history. For example, how policy-relevant ideas emerge and acquire political power, including by energizing social movements and mobilizing broad coalitions. As I mentioned, dramatic institutional change historically has often occurred in the aftermath of demonstrable policy failure, moments where crisis or catastrophe discredits established orthodoxies, loosens attachment of policymakers and leaders to old ways of doing things, and leaves them open to considering alternative beliefs, frameworks, or models. And the archetypal example, as you all know, of this is the triumph of Keynesianism in the wake of the Great Depression, World War II in particular, when governments of most developed countries accepted a new role for the state in the market, rejecting the laissez-faire orthodoxy for a more managed form of capitalism that became embodied in and tolerated by the initial Bretton Woods system. That system, in turn, faced challenges of its own in the 1970s, contributing to the triumph of market liberalism in the wake of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. And importantly, a transformation whose seeds were planted by many historical accounts decades earlier in the work of Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others, and what became a global network of scholars and think tank experts, a revolution that, among other things, transformed modern capitalism. Now, there are efforts afoot, including by a number of foundations, to try to seed precisely this sort of thing in a progressive direction. So I would commend those to you. Some of you already may be involved in those efforts. And again, the question before us today is whether we are another possible inflection point, and what might history teach us about how to reinforce or accelerate this trend. The second point, which is related, is that any reimagined and reformed system of global economic governance would require building a world economy that rewards labor as much as capital. While many of the critical decisions about political economy, including safety nets, for instance, would be domestic ones, I think the multilateral component will be critical. At least some common rules, such as over minimum rates of taxation or subsidies, would be important to ensure that gains from globalization are broadly shared not only within but across countries, in part by preventing a race to the bottom. The first 2 decades after 1945 saw some of the greatest shared prosperity in history, at least within became the OECD world. There were ones in which trade benefited lower classes much more than it does now, and when countries had more flexibility to pursue progressive social policies than they do today. We need to rediscover something along the lines of a compromise of embedded liberalism, which could have the potential to defang populism. Third, we need to govern the world as if the earth mattered. We need to invest in natural capital as much as we do in human, physical, and financial capital. Our environmental emergency reflects a collision between 2 different systems, the earth system and the international system. The first, obviously, is a living planet as seen from outer space, an integrated entity that recognizes no physical boundaries. The second is a political planet divided up into 193 sovereign nations. Runaway climate change, biodiversity collapse, and rampant pollution have all revealed a fundamental contradiction between these two systems and the need to close this gap. It's slowly dawning on us after all these years that nature is not something that's nice to have, but indeed a fundamental precondition for human well-being. And resolving this contradiction requires that we fundamentally overhaul our existing economic models, which continue to treat environmental damage as an unavoidable externality of market activity and extraction, rather than investing in natural capital assets. And so over the past year and a half, we've actually seen some tentative national and multilateral initiatives focusing on climate change that seek to break the long established narrative pitting climate action against global growth and development. Obviously, we've seen lots of EU initiatives. We've seen the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the global level. We've seen the Bridgetown Agenda, President Macron's summit on a new global financing pact. And we've seen the World Bank's new evolution roadmap, which envisions, quote, a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And all three are grounded in two propositions. The battle against climate change is not a costly distraction from the imperative development, but an important component of it. And second, poor countries should not have to choose between climate adaptation and mitigation, other development priorities. The question remains, and it's a big question, as to whether or not the wealthy world is going to get anywhere near the financing, which may cost more than $100 trillion through 2050 to meet net zero targets. The last thing that actually, there's a couple more things, and then I'll finish. The fourth thing we need to do is broaden the gains from the digital revolution to create its winner-take-all dynamics. We're all aware of these breathtaking advances in digital technology, but the concentrated benefits are remarkable, and they're remarkably obscene. AI has the potential to become a general purpose technology that could be as ubiquitous and taken for granted as electricity, but obviously its gains remain highly unevenly distributed. Along with my colleague Emma Klein, I've just co-written a Carnegie working paper on the emerging global regime complex for governing AI. And as we point out, there are mind-boggling opportunities for bettering the human condition. But realizing these possibilities will require not only attention to safety and security, but also ensuring the broadest possible access and benefit sharing within and across countries. These goals may not always be consistent, however, with the profit motives of technology platforms. So one of the critical priorities is building out digital public infrastructure, which are secure, interoperable, governed, and trusted systems of digital technologies that private citizens can access, the public can access for public services. One of the critical unknowns when we think about the digital future is which of three global models will dominate. The EU model, which in the new EU Act places accent on rights and privacy, a US model, which emphasizes market efficiency and corporate autonomy, or a Chinese model, which emphasizes authoritarian state control in an Orwellian society. Finally, we need to make room at the top, is my last point. The US and other Western powers need to make space for rising powers in developing countries in major multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to say nothing of the UN Security Council. These institutions were created when most nations in the world were still colonies. It is very difficult and not always very popular to give up control, but failing to make some reasonable adjustments will only undermine the legitimacy of these institutions going forward. The unipolar moment is over. Instead of doubling down on primacy at huge expense, the United States in particular needs to reform multilateralism for the coming multipolar moment. I will stop there. I know I've put a huge amount on the table, and I apologize if I've gone on a little bit longer, but Albena, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Now we will give the floor directly to Victor Jakupec, and then we will discuss the two papers together. Victor, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fine. Let me just try to go to the share screen. If that's going to work. Share. Is the screen visible to everyone?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let me start with some basic observations. Firstly, I would like to say that I'm trying to, well, I have put my head on the chopping block because I'm talking about what is going to be in the future without knowing what actually is going to happen between now and when this future arises. So nevertheless, I'm going to look at or discuss, if I may, multipolarity and the post-Ukraine war new world order. Here I assume that there's going to be a new world order, and every indication is that we may experience it. And at the same time, there is a focus on the rise of populism. So to put it in a different way, the basic premise is that the Russian-Ukraine war has intensified the shift from a liberal rules-based world order towards a multipolar populist world order, whatever that may mean. I will come to that. In other words, since the onset of the Ukrainian war, the world experienced a decisive shift to multipolarity. Secondly, it experienced the prospect of new world order or multiplicity of competing world orders, and a rise of national populism in the global north as well as the global south. At the same time, we are seeing that there's a rise in Euroscepticism and aligned with that populism, and that is apparent in quite a number of EU countries, like in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, in Austria with the Freiheitliche Partei, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Portugal, Italy, and France. And more recently, we have seen it also in Argentina. So there's also, as previous speakers have already alerted to, there's a real prospect of Trump's return to the White House, which should cement the US turn to national populism, in my opinion. With this in mind, my questions for today are, how will the Russo-Ukrainian war end? Let's go to the next slide. How will the Russo-Ukrainian war end? What will be the post-Russo-Ukrainian war world order? Now, there are a number of scenarios, and they are not all inclusive. With ending the Ukraine war is that there's a potential of a frozen conflict. There is also a potential of escalation, and winner takes all. So one side wins, the other one loses. More of the same, so a protracted war of attrition, and others like the peace proposals. My thesis is that the post-war setting will see a liberal rules-based order plus a multipolar populist world order. So there will be not one, but there will probably be two or more different competing multipolar populist orders. So now, as I said before, much will depend, of course, then on how actually this war ends. Now, the points which I would like to address within that is next. What I would like to address are political paradigm shift. So what we are seeing now, in my opinion, is that with the elections which are coming up, there will be a rise of populism and the demise of liberalism, if the polls, election polls, have any credence. The Russia-Ukrainian war, the second point, as a could be seen as a geopolitical and geoeconomical change agent. The third point is the emergence of multiple alliances. So on the one side, the BRICS and BRICS Plus, which sort of since 1st of January of this year does exist, as well as the non-aligned movement. That, of course, also takes into consideration the current multipolar alliances. The second last point is the nexus between multipolarity and populism, which I would like to address. And then the last point or the conclusion of my talk should be a post-Russian-Ukrainian war, multipolar, populist world order. I hope I can get it all through in the given time, but I will do my best. I may have to shorten some of the thing. So what I'm trying to basically to say is the Russo-Ukrainian war has catalyzed significant political paradigm shifts, particularly seen in the transition from liberalism to populism across various global contexts. As a conflict unfolded, we have seen geopolitical ramification exposed by vulnerabilities of liberal democratic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the United Nations Security Council, the European Council, the United Nations General Assembly, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and the European Central Bank, and those fueled disillusionment among populations with traditional political establishment. We have seen deindustrialization, which causes, of course, unemployment, rising cost of living due to the various factors, but also the war, the political disempowerment of the general population. If you look in number of countries where actually the politicians are making quite openly the statement that they decide even if those decisions are against the majority of their own population. Typical examples which I can find are basically in Germany at the moment. One of the reasons for this shift, my argument is, from liberalism is that the vast majority of population in the EU countries is becoming economically disadvantaged, disillusioned to the sanctions regime or the impact of the sanction regime, which in my opinion has actually backfired. So what we have in terms of differences here is the liberal political leadership focuses on Western liberal values and ideologies at an expense of national interest as seen by the wider population. We also see that populist political leadership focuses on national economic issues and alleviation of the negative impact of sanctions. And thirdly, we see that the populism is emerging as an important political economic force with national focus, and thus populism is reshaping geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think what I should say, however, in my defense here is that I have taken quite unashamedly a realist point of view. Now let's come to our impact of elections. This year, 2024, is a year of many important and far-reaching elections. We just have witnessed one, and that is Putin has secured for another 6 years his presidency. But setting that aside, what is more important is that there are the European parliamentary elections, and there's a surge, as I said before, in many European countries, including the previous mentioned Germany, Austria, Hungary, France, Italy, Sweden, Finland, and others. Poland is the one exception which changed back, hopefully, to liberal democracy, whereas the others have shifted more or less towards populism. We have the US presidential elections. We have seen what has happened in Argentina, and cumulative, the EU elections tend to bring a political paradigm shift, in my opinion. So it will weaken the liberal rules-based world order. And here I'm referring to the order which emerged and has been changed since the Bretton Woods. And it is also strengthening the rise of multipolar populist world order. Now, with regards to the situation, I'm looking at the political paradigm shift, and that in terms of rise of populism and the demise of liberalism. And again, I'm coming back to the Russia-Ukrainian war, which is, in my opinion, a catalyst for further rise of populism. So the longer it goes, the more we probably see rise of populism, at least in the global north. We'll also see eroding neoliberalism globally, I think. And we are going to, there will be highlighting weaknesses of institutions. Now, showing the war itself or the effects of the war will show the inability of liberal institutions to address complex international relations. In end effect, but I think what is going to happen is there's a popular disillusionment with the liberal ideologies in many countries and amongst the population. There is also potential effect of fueling the appeal of populist movements, us against them, and the return of national interest and the sovereignty. If I look at the Russia-Ukrainian war as a geopolitical and geoeconomic change agent, I come to, in my analysis, the following understanding. We are seeing this information. Just bear with me. That's no. No, I must have missed a. Oh, okay. No. Sorry about that. How do I get to the previous slide? Here. So in the geopolitical, geoeconomic framework, I think that the shifts with impact on the liberal entities, like the NATO, the EU, and other alliances, will force nations to align themselves in a multiple scenario, be it with the Western alliances, being with the BRICS, being with potential a new non-aligned movement. I'm coming to that a little bit later. Now, the shifts also accelerate tension, prompting diplomatic recalibration. If you look at Hungary, Turkey, and the Western Balkans, now, although Hungary and Turkey are in NATO, they do not necessarily pull in the same direction. And Poland was the same pre-2023, and the Balkan states, Western Balkan states, is a big question mark. Now, the problem what we have with the Global South is that many Global South countries are criticizing EU and the US and are basically seeing them with the Russian-Ukrainian war as a way of neo-colonization. And we can see that because the Global South is non-compliant, or many of the Global South countries are not compliant with the Western sanctions. Now, so the next point is the emergence of multipolar alliances. So what we have emerging a picture is the Global South against the Global North. Now, the Global South shifts away from the Washington consensus and moves more towards the Beijing consensus. Means this is the shift from liberalism to national populism. There's a formation of new alliances, which I mentioned before, and that is the BRICS Plus, and there's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we have still unity despite competing agenda, which just leads us potentially to multipolarity. I'm thinking about countries of the middle size or middle strong countries like Turkey, which is both have the feed in the Beijing consensus as well as the Washington consensus or the US alliance. Now, if you look at the BRICS and BRICS Plus, originally, as you know, BRICS was a bloc, I suppose is the right term, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. As from 1st of January 24, we have now added to it Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and that accounts for about 48% of world population. And in addition, there's a shift towards membership there. There are apparently another 30 countries have either applied for membership or have expressed interest. So what does it mean? What is actually BRICS Plus about? Now, BRICS Plus is generally positioning itself or the bloc against the existing liberal rule-based world order. And it also is pursuing a policy, or at least tentatively, of a force against this previously mentioned neocolonialism. In real terms, what it means that the West has lost the global hegemonic status, and we have seen the rise of regional middle powers, and that is, again, like Iran, Turkey, and others. So if my analysis stands to reason, we are seeing actually advance of the multipolar world. The previously mentioned situation, I'd like to address it just very briefly, is the emergence of the multipolar alliances. So what we have is, if I set aside the multipolarity consisting of the Western Alliance and the BRICS Plus bloc, there's a renaissance of non-aligned movement. It mirrors the non-aligned movement bloc which existed during the Cold War, which included India, Egypt, Ethiopia, former Yugoslavia, and others. Today, however, we have slightly different situation that the non-aligned movement includes countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, more so than it was in the previous non-aligned movement. So that means that we are looking at a return to the policy of a non-alignment, which is causing growing concern among policymakers in Western capital, because as a bloc, the non-aligned movement countries pursue national populist agendas to a large extent on the international stage. They have the capacity to challenge traditional alliances and the international norms in global forums like the UN, World Trade Organization, etc. And they can introduce increased competing layers of complexity as far as the geopolitical landscape is concerned. Being cognizant of the time, they haven't pushed all the slides. So let me look at the nexus between multipolarity and populism. In terms of the analysis, of my analysis, there is, as I mentioned before, emerging multipolar populism. I'm sorry, my time here in Australia is almost 2 o'clock, and my brain doesn't function that well, so I hope you forgive me for that. So let me come to the nexus between multipolarity and populism. So emerging multipolar populism has the following characteristics or tendencies, if you wish. It definitely will not replace the existing liberal world order, in my opinion, but the former will become a counterforce to the latter. So there will be a balance between those two. Subsequently, there will be most likely a form of coexistence and a nexus between those two, and perhaps more geopolitically constructs, alliances and blocs will emerge and cooperate and coexist. But be this as it may, the nexus between multipolarity and populism represents a complex interplay of geopolitical dynamics and domestic political forces that shape the contemporary global landscape. This means that with a framework of emerging nexus between those two, the distribution of political, economic, and military power will change. Populism can, of course, attach itself to or become part of multilateralism, leading to multipolar world order or orders. Now, coming to my conclusion, to look at the post-Russia-Ukrainian war multipolar populist world order, it's always a mouthful. There are three constituents which I have identified, which come out of the points I raised before. There's the multipolarity, there's populism, and there's the world order. Now, the advantages of this multipolar populist world order is that, seen from a realist point of view, is that it enhances national sovereignty. It also provides a greater diversity of geopolitical and geoeconomic perspectives. It resilience against hegemony and provides empowerment of grassroots movements, focuses on national political economic priorities, and provides protection of social cultural identity. I will finish with those unhappy thoughts, and I hand over back to the coordinator. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Now you've been very concise and respectful of the time. We have about 20 minutes for discussion. Keep sending your comments online or raise your hand, please, with questions. I do not see any hands. Maybe I can start off. There is one. Okay. We have a question from Bulent Keynes. Thank you for these intriguing presentations. My question is for Dr. Stuart Patrick. As you delve into the complexity of reimagining global economic governance, how do you envision the influence of emerging AI technologies and new tools of information technology on the future landscape of global governance structure and institutions? Specifically, how might AI address challenges related to transparency, accountability, security, and ethical considerations, and what impact could it potentially have on the creation of new classes and class gaps in global scale?
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating question. There are tremendous efforts underway right now, both at the national level and increasingly at the multilateral level, to make sure that AI in and of itself is used in ethical and human-centered ways. And there was obviously a flurry of activity in late November and early December, including the UK Safety Summit, and that process continues. The difficulty is that although all countries are rhetorically committed to very high-minded adjectives like human-centered, ethical, transparent, accountable, etc. Actually putting flesh on the details of those safety considerations in terms of what would be acceptable use cases, as they say, of AI. Getting down into detail is much more complicated. And so trying to translate those into common standards and much less regulatory regimes is going to be very challenging, and particularly ensuring those are interoperable. I have some doubts as to whether or not open societies, or relatively open societies, will be able to reach some common ground with closed societies, authoritarian governments. So I'm not holding my breath that in the case of China, for instance, that one would be able to come up with any major standards. That being said, there is an effort underway by the Secretary General of the United Nations, appointed a high-level advisory body on AI, which made recommendations, preliminary recommendations in an interim report for how the multilateral system might try to advance, equitable access to AI, safe uses of AI, deal with issues of dual use problems of AI and its potential implications for proliferation, and such matters. And they're going to, you may be aware that there's something called the Summit of the Future, which the UN Secretariat and member states are going to hold in the opening of the UN General Assembly. As part of that, they're supposed to endorse a global digital compact. And some of the issues that you address are hopefully going to be taken up within that document that would be endorsed. Just more broadly, I should say that one of the conclusions of the paper that we wrote was that rather the people for a while were talking about an International Atomic Energy Agency for AI or an IPCC for AI. Our conclusion in the paper is that there will be a messier regime complex, basically of overlapping institutions for different functional purposes. And even within particular functions, there will be a number of different agencies, so that there will not be one entire effort to try to make everything coherent. And so a lot of the emphasis will be on making specific international agencies AI literate, as opposed to necessarily creating one institution to cover all of artificial intelligence. Apologies for the long-winded response, but hopefully that helped.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Luis.
Thank you, Professor.
Gisberg, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. This is wonderful. Obviously, the complexity is huge, but I wonder if there is some hint, particularly in the last presentation, about the resistance. And in fact, of course, even in the United States, Trump is a resistance movement to the great progress that has been made in increased diversity and ethnic equality. And that is true in many, many parts of the world, I think. And particularly, I think we're neglecting to pay attention to the greater equality between men and women, and the role that women are increasingly playing. And that tends to make less reliance, I think, on military action. The data have suggested that in the past. And there are great progress being made in conflict resolution and ways in which public administration incorporates popular views. So I want to put that into the pot as well.
Okay, we have a question from Ertugrul in Sekul regarding how populist movements frame immigration policies in relation to democratic values. So I understand this to mean they give that narrative of, you know, anti-immigrant stance as a protection of the well-being of the national community, right? So how would that then impact public perceptions of immigration? Did I understand this question correctly? I'm not sure.
Yes, Albana, thank you. Yes, it's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I take a stab at that really quickly. I think that there is a you know, there is a legitimate argument to be made there, that and a reflection of popular sovereignty, right? That in a democracy, democracy is a privileged polity in which and conceivably could be sharing certain values, political values. Sometimes it's done in sort of uglier ways, where there's a sense that the polity is sort of an ethno-nationalist sort of entity. But you know, there could be, particularly when it comes to irregular immigration into a country, there can be, you know, a democratic argument, a small d democratic argument, that a polity should be able to control flows of people inside in a regular way, in and out of the country, and that's you know, a fundamental way of protecting, in a sense, democratic values. So I can see how that argument could be made in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a totally nativist and absurdly xenophobic response, because it's not as if uncontrolled migration is necessarily a good into a country.
I would like to come into that, if I may. I think we have to look at the migration crisis, and we have migration crisis obviously in the US, which is quite a different aspect, has different aspects from the migration crisis which exists in Europe, because they've been caused by two different things. We have to go, as far as Europe is concerned, in order to understand the migration crisis, we have to go back to Merkel's policies on migration, where she basically declared, when she was still the chancellor, that we can do it. There have been hundreds of thousands, I don't know now the figure exactly, of migrants came at that time. That was not about 2015, when the migration crisis started. Huge amount of people came basically to Europe and to Germany, and basically, well, some countries said we are not going to take migrants. It was Merkel who basically then put a policy into place so we can do it. Now, that is quite different from the migration crisis in the US, in my opinion. So when we talk about those things, we have to be quite careful in which context we put the migration issue, legal, social, or whatever other aspects we want to put onto it. So I would suggest we should keep those two issues separate, or the crisis separate.
Thank you for your comments. Especially, I was on the European side. Yes, as you said, Victor. Yes, for the European aspect, I would like to ask, but thank you very much for the answers and comments. Thanks.
Okay, how about Amna Benamara? Go ahead, and I have a couple more.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm Amna Benamara, a researcher. I'm originally from Tunisia, and I'm currently based in Slovenia. So I've been researching actually populism and populist politics, you know, for more than 3 years, and I published a few academic articles on this. And I really want to thank the participant who actually spoke about the importance of discourse when it comes to populism. And my point here is that the power of populist discourse, actually, or populist leaders, lies in their capacity to present themselves as the father presidents, the father leaders, the heroes, and the saviors. And this identity construction mechanism, does not only endow these leaders with the power and the moral authority to set the rules for the national home or the national house, but also to discipline and even punish those violating the rules of the national house, which are in certain cases migrants or political elites or the other more generally. So here the importance of discourse, the importance of metaphors, the family metaphor, the house or the home metaphor, which is a kind of very, very strongly present in populist discourse, whether consciously or unconsciously orients the public towards this quest for being protected and for being guided by these leaders.
Very much, very true. Ibrahim, well, that was a remark. That was not a question. It was a very
yeah. So it was
very appropriate component of a feature of populism. Ibrahim, you raised the hand. Please go. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I would like to direct my question to Stewart. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you very much for participating in our symposium. You have already partly mentioned, but just I would like to take attention again to the same point. So currently, the current globalization process is not working efficiently in distributive terms, in terms of distribution, equal distribution, fair distribution of global outcome is not effective so much. But we need an agent who can function as a game changer. It seems we don't see even such a political will in the United States who can trigger such a reform process so that the dominance of multinational companies can be balanced through some reform activities. I wonder who, what, or what kind of factors or which agents can lead such a process. Where lies the solution in that regard?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that there are certain aspects of the Biden administration have been more radical and progressive than he actually ran as a candidate. People sometimes joke that he ran against Bernie Sanders, but then once when he was elected, he actually governed a little bit more like Bernie Sanders than in terms of than one would have imagined from his sort of previous record as a legislator. So there have been moves and legislative victories like the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. There's also been, and this is more on the national security front, but the CHIPS Act to regulate supply of chips to advanced semiconductors to China. But I would imagine that if Biden is elected again, if he's reelected, that there will be some, and if he has a majority in both houses of Congress. Again, these are highly unknown as to whether or not that will occur, and it's quite up in the air at this stage. That he would continue moving in a more progressive direction. The one area where I believe that I just don't see much willingness to really do what needs to be done is in regulating technology platforms. This is the level of concentration of wealth is so extraordinary, and of course, when this happened in the early part of the 20th century, there was, even Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt made his name in some ways as a trust buster, basically breaking up some of the monopoly power of these just massive technology platforms. And I just don't see a significant movement in that direction. Some movement, he has, proposed taxes on billionaires, et cetera, but I don't see enough of a break with a very market-based system that distinguishes much of the United States from Europe in this regard.
Thank you, Stuart. I will take one last question, and this is from Selçuk Gültasli. Given this is a question to Professor Jakubec, given the surge of national populism in Europe and the possibility of a huge win for populists at the upcoming European Parliament elections, do you think the European Union, as a liberal institution, has the resilience to counter this populist offensive? Great question to finish.
Yes, it is a great question. And I have to do a little bit of crystal balling here. It depends on so many factors. I would say that there is a strong potential, or at least a potential, that EU, as we know it today, will not necessarily exist in 5 to 10 years' time. We will see that there are going to be splinter groups in there, and which will make then the EU potentially unworkable. You will have potentially depends on how many new countries will join EU, of course, but if you have the Western Balkans joining in, we can see a potential renaissance of the of Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, which was impacting on the EU. And we don't know about some of the smaller countries, which also have the voice and how they're going to align themselves with the bigger countries. So I would say that they're going to be rocky times ahead.
Right.
I don't know if I answered the question, but too much of crystal balling still there.
The jury is still out. Yeah, we'll see. Irina von Wiese has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Albina. No, just a quick remark following up on Victor. I understand your realism, but I would want to give maybe a slightly more optimistic outlook on the European elections, having seen how, in reality, those alliances within the European Parliament at least work. Even if, as is predicted by a number of pollsters, there should be a resurgence and potentially a majority of the anti-democratic, anti-European forces, notably on the far right, after the next elections, which I think is still in doubt. But even if there is, I think an experience has shown that those forces are not united. They have tried in the past to unite within the European Parliament. They have failed simply because their national populist strands are so far apart from each other, and they disagree on so many precise policy issues, because obviously populists don't do precise policy as a general rule. That we've seen in the past, there's those attempts, particularly by ID, on the right and the non-inscrits, that those who are not members of any particular bloc, and the far left on the other side have just failed. So I am a bit more optimistic. I do think the pro-European forces, as much as they may disagree, in practice will try to rally together, that is the four centrist parties, in order to keep out the populists. I hope, of course, that I'm right. There is, I don't want to downplay the challenges and the threat that the resurgence of national populists everywhere pose. But I would like to give this kind of more optimistic view, maybe to conclude this really interesting panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to our presenters and to the audience so engaged. Let us have a 10-minute break before the next panel and convene at 3:30 Central European time. So in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you. I hope I may be excused. It is
Yes.
1:20 in the morning here. So my apologies, but I think, as probably President Biden would say, I have to go to bed now.
All right.
So
Good night to you.
thank
Have a
you
good
very
sleep.
much.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
sleep.
Thank you, Victor, for making the time.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
And
Okay,
well done for staying awake for so long.
I shall be in touch. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone. Bye. Bye.
I think time is has already arrived to start the second panel discussion. In this second panel, we will moderator. Dr. Nora Fischer-Onar will be our moderator in this session. Associate Professor of International Studies at the University of San Francisco. Thank you very much for joining us. That's very kind of you, Dr. Fischer. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim Öztürk, for organizing this exceptionally timely event, and also for bringing together such a genuinely global set of voices. It's quite, operationally, it's not easy to pull this off, and it really does justice to the scope of the issue which we're tackling today, which is the rise of global populism, and how that interfaces with global power shift and new trends in international order. So thanks to you and the organizers, and of course the participants and audience. With this panel, we are lucky to have several panelists who have expertise on multiple world regions. They also share an abiding interest in the interface between sort of material concerns, international political economy on one hand, and normative concerns like democratic resilience and human rights on the other. So I will follow my marching orders and invite the speakers to present for maximum 20 minutes each, and I'll alert you in the chat box when you're 5 minutes from time. And then I will also aggregate questions. I believe there's a chat box, actually. I will aggregate questions if participants want to plug them in as the speaker is speaking. And of course, we'll also devote 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Marina Nord, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the V Democratic Institute of the University of Gothenburg. And she's an expert on both Europe and I believe Russia, and will be speaking to us on the third wave of autocratization and the case of democratic reversals. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to share my screen. I hope it works. Oh. That's always, I'm sorry, technical difficulties.
It's inevitable. We've all been in that place in the Zoom room.
Oh, it tells me that Zoom may not be able to record my contents of the screen until I quit. I may start talking, maybe someone can share the screen. That would be if I quickly send the presentation to someone. Would it work?
Yes, you can send to Ibrahim and he can forward us.
Yeah, that would be great. For some reason, I'm really sorry. I don't know why it's such. Or maybe we just let's do someone else start speaking, so that I don't take the time and we switch the order. Would it work?
Shall we ask Professor?
I will send the presentation to someone. Sorry, I'm really sorry for
By the way, if you don't mind, shall we ask Professor Bahus if he would like to start, because he is on a travel. He may not have enough time for that, but just this is my idea. Just if you don't mind, Ms. Fischer, you can ask to him.
Yes, of course. Professor Bahus, are you available to switch places with Dr. Nord?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Let me do the honor of introducing you very briefly, and then the floor will be yours. So you are the Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs and the Director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the School of Politics of the University of Central Florida. You're also former chairman of the WTO appellate body, and you're going to speak to us about the nexus of globalization, economics, rule of law, and human rights when it comes to the populist challenge.
Well, thank you so much. It may also be relevant to this topic to mention that before I was a judge at the WTO, I was a member of the Congress of the United States. And for those who are wondering, I am a Democrat, and people are always too polite to ask. In the United States, if you're a former member of Congress, then people assume that you lost, and that's why you left, because otherwise, why would anyone leave such a cushy, easy job? I remain undefeated here. I left of my own free will, and then later went to the WTO. This is an extremely critical topic. So I was very happy to accept the invitation when my colleague Naim Capuccio, who I believe is on this call, recommended that I participate. And I am happy to be with all of you. Stuart Patrick and a couple of my other friends and fellow travelers from my global do-gooding have also been on this call. I look forward to the opportunity to get to know more of you. If you would like for me to come visit you someday, just let me know. I continue to globetrot. Let me say at the outset that I am someone who believes we have a duty of optimism. In this, I'm influenced by the philosopher of science and much else, the late Sir Karl Popper. I think that as human beings who are destined to try to live together, we have an obligation to try to be hopeful and forward-looking in our perception of where we're going and where we're likely to get. So I'm someone who has devoted my entire life, as I think all of you have, to various forms of service, because I think that humanity is one and we need to act as one in trying to fulfill the full flourishing of our striving and struggling species. Right now, we have some unprecedented challenges that we're simply not meeting. Climate change is one. I was one of the legal advisors to the climate COP leading up to the Paris Agreement. I was one of the members of Congress more than 30 years ago who started efforts in my own country to address climate change. I'm still working on that issue. More broadly, there is the need for sustainable development, with which you're all familiar. I've been much involved in the efforts first to create the Sustainable Development Goals, and now against increasingly great odds to try to fulfill them. I know that many of you are doing the same. I'm also an academic, and I have written a great deal about international political economy, international law, and I've just finished a book that is now in peer review on what I see as the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. I hope it will be published later this year. The sad truth is it's quite hard to be an optimist these days. I've appreciated the fact that a few of you have weighed in your remarks by saying, well, I think we need to be a little bit more optimistic. And I agree with that, but clearly it's a challenge. And the challenge is one that we face not only in my own country, but as has been made clear in the remarks and presentations already today, is a challenge that exists in different ways and in different contexts throughout the world. The danger, I think, in being so pessimistic about populism is that we might accept the premise that more popular involvement in our politics is necessarily harmful. This to me is not so. To me, that's an elitist view that would confirm the views of many populists that people like us are elitist, especially me. I have WTO stamped on my forehead, not to mention some of the other things I've done along the way. But it seems to me that the potential for more public participation can be positive as well as negative in the world. I think we need to look at what's happening politically and geopolitically in the world in the light of that. I recall here decades ago when I was a graduate student at Yale in history. I was studying the history of the United States and particularly the history of my native South, and read and thought a great deal, wrote papers on the populist movement in the United States in the last decades of the 19th century. And all in all, in my judgment, and that of many historians, the populist movement of that time in the United States was a positive influence on the broadening and deepening of American democracy and justice. The populists themselves did not win the presidency, but many of their ideas were adopted by the Democratic Party and to a lesser extent by the Republican Party of the time. Mention has already been made of Teddy Roosevelt. Ideas such as the direct election of senators, the radical notion of having a personal income tax, and much more were originally populist ideas. They were part of what were called the Ocala demands that were the result of a convention of the Populist Party in Ocala, Florida in 1890, just about 75 miles from where I sit right now in Orlando. So it seems to me that the challenge is one of galvanizing popular participation in a way that produces positive and not negative results. As we all know, most of what's happened thus far over the past decade or so, as we've seen in the aftermath of the global recession and now exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and emergence of dangerous forms of populism. In my own country, in the past few days, the putative nominee of one of our parties for the presidency of the United States, a man who has already somehow served as president, has said that some immigrants are not people. A shocking statement of dehumanization, and has predicted a bloodbath if he does not win the election. These are not things that have traditionally occurred in American presidential politics, yet they're increasingly commonplace, and the coarsening and the worsening of our politics is come upon us over the past 20 years and is gradually gotten worse. And I fear that some of these predictions that are being made will happen if the forces that currently control populism prevail in my country. There is, as has already been noted, both left-wing populism and right-wing populism. Right now in my country, we have mostly a manifestation of right-wing populism. But there's a potential also for left-wing populism. And as has already been noted, no one has tried to engage with people in any way that would truly respond to the legitimate concerns that many ordinary people in our country do have, not even my party. And to the extent that they seem to have tried to respond, I would submit that for the most part, they responded in the wrong ways. It's, in my view, a great idea to tax me and other upper income people more to provide more services for those who need them. But it's not a good idea to engage in trade protectionism, which only shrinks our economy in the long term and does not strengthen the competitiveness of our people in the world in the short or the long term. And no one has tried to lead in this country in the way, for example, that a century ago Franklin Delano Roosevelt led. And that's the kind of leadership that I think America needs. We don't have it, and we're unlikely to get it in this election. But I do think the potential is there for something positive. Now, to me, this is most likely to come through more democracy and not less, but it's more likely to come from a different kind of democracy than currently prevails in most supposedly democratic countries. Of course, as you know, we have many countries that claim to be democracies, but are not. It's merely a pretense. They're nominal democracies. And of course, they need to become real democracies. Getting them from here to there will not be easy. And then we have democracies that are democratic republics that are more or less genuine in how democratic they are. Our friends in Indonesia, where I'll be flying later today, are about to face a test. Having had a democratic election, they've elected someone who in the past has not always seemed to be supportive of democracy. We'll see what happens there. In other places, we've seen challenges. I know we'll hear later about what's happened in Latin America from one of the experts in the world who's on this panel, but look at Brazil going back and forth. Look at what's happened in Venezuela and in Colombia and Argentina and elsewhere in South America.
You have about, yes, you're at the 5-minute point.
To me, what we need to do is have what I would call a strong democracy. I borrow this phrase from the late political philosopher Benjamin Barber, and this is one that is much more participatory. And I would wed this democracy to much more intensive attempts at human development and at overall sustainable development. Here, of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, but the notion of sustainable development exists separate and apart from the goals, however we may define or label them. It's the concept of full human flourishing in a way that will enable all people to fulfill their greatest potential. And in the context in which we, more than we have done in the past, vastly more, respect the natural world and understand that we are part of it. This is simply not happening. To do this, we need, of course, efforts within democracy to promote affirmative kinds of citizenship and participation. In my forthcoming book, I have a lot of suggestions about what that might be, but these must be means that will either create trust or restore trust where we've lost it, that will provide the right kind of leadership, as opposed to the finger in the wind and often bought and paid for leadership we have now in our democracies, and will thereby help create the political will to make the great transition we must make toward a sustainable zero carbon world. I'm going to stop there, and I'll stay as long as I can to be able to answer questions. Again, my appreciation for the invitation, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists will say. I know I will learn a great deal from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this very rich intervention, and we look forward to hopefully hearing some of your suggestions about how we can have more affirmative participation moving forward. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Kurt Wayland, who is joining us from California, like myself. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you're in Texas, I believe. That's right. It was in the former panel, there was a Californian. So Dr. Wayland, although he is situated in Texas at the moment, brings to us immense expertise on Latin America and Europe, which he studies an ambitious comparative perspective as a professor of politics at the professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin. And so the floor is yours. And again, I will alert you, if your chat box is open, actually, I can alert you in writing when you are at 5 minutes left.
Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion of populism. And so what I will try to argue is that the threat that populism poses to democracy is real and serious, but it is not as severe as people have depicted it. So some type of good news in line with what Professor Bacchus said before. So essentially, the big concern, of course, arose, especially in 2016, with the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump, because the United States is widely considered the paragon of liberal democracy. So if an autocratic populist gets elected even there and then tries to concentrate power to push aside checks and balances, this is of great concern. And the idea was that if even in the United States something like that can happen, other countries are much more threatened. And of course, we can easily think of emblematic cases of populist leaders who ended up actually asphyxiating democracy. Alberto Fujimori in Peru, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, all come to mind and are, for example, raised in the famous and excellent book by Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Died. So great concern. So what I do is I try to figure out how serious this concern actually is. And so what I argue is that the strong focus on those cases where populist leaders have actually strangled democracy can be a little misleading, because there were many populist leaders that actually ended up being in government, but who did not actually destroy democracy. And so we have to have a fuller picture of populism. We have to look at a comprehensive set of populist cases and then see how likely are they actually to get away with, to manage to destroy democracy, and what are the conditions under which that happens. And that's what I'm doing in that book that's just coming out from Cambridge right now, Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat. So, and what I do there is I start with my political strategic definition of populism that essentially highlights populism as revolving around personalistic plebiscitarian leadership. So personalistic means you have these big domineering figures, these leaders who think they have a divine mission to carry out what they perceive as being the will of the people. And so for that purpose, they want to have power, they want to have clout, they don't want to face constraints. And that is inherently a problem and a threat for democracy, because democracy, especially in its liberal version, tries to constrain personalistic authority. It tries to impose checks and balances to prevent the abuse of power. And so this populist personalism naturally runs up against one of the core features of liberal democracy. The second feature of populism in my definition is that they base their quest for power and their exercise of power on plebiscitarian mass support. which means that they try to establish a direct personal emotional connection to largely amorphous, broad, largely unorganized mass of followers. And they do this in this direct personal contact rather than through organized, disciplined kinds of organizations and parties. And that is a problem too, because given that there isn't a disciplined, reliable base of support, what populist leaders try to do, they try to supercharge their appeals. They try to emphasize that they are fighting against dangerous enemies of the people, to induce a rally around the flag such that that the people support them against these dangerous enemies. And that is a problem because it undermines civil, electoral, democratic competition. From the populist perspective, democratic competitors are not legitimate alternatives, but they're enemies and adversaries to be fought. And so essentially populist leaders turn politics into a war, and that is a problem for democracy. So I agree with a lot of the established literature. I agree with a lot of concerns that for these reasons, populism is inherently a problem and a threat for democracy. But as I just said, when you look at the actual record of what populists in government do, I examine in that book 40 cases of populist leaders who won power in Latin America and in Europe over the last 3-4 decades. And what you see is that among those 40 cases, only 7 actually ended up destroying democracy. So it's not that it's that common. It's not that it's that easy. It's not that when a populist leader comes to power, democracy faces a very high risk of being overturned. So then the issue, of course, is once we have that finding, what are the specific conditions under which populists manage to destroy democracy, under which they can really enact their power concentrating aspirations? And what I emphasize there is, and it's related to that initial definition of populism, 2 factors are very important. As I said, personalistic leadership is constrained in democracy by institutions. So conversely, where institutions are weak, that personalistic leadership has more capacity for expansion, they have more ability to concentrate power. So the weaker institutions are, the greater is the actual threat of populism. So that's one factor. And we see, of course, that where institutions are strong, like in Western Europe or in the United States, populists end up not doing very much damage to the institutionality of democracy. The damage occurs in regions where institutions are weaker, like Latin America and Eastern Europe. But while institutional weakness is a necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy, it is not sufficient. And you can see, even under conditions of high institutional instability, populists do not necessarily manage to destroy democracy. Think of the recent case of Pedro Castillo in Peru. Peru, by the time Castillo surprisingly won office in 2021, had sunk into high instability with a number of presidential crises, turmoil, and whatever. Peruvian democracy was precarious, but nevertheless, Pedro Castillo did not manage to overturn Peruvian democracy. So institutional weakness is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. The other condition that is necessary as well is, and it's related to my initial definition of democracy, is there are opportunities for these populist leaders to boost, to extend their plebiscitarian mass support. So that's the plebiscitarian side of populism. Where populist leaders win massive, intense support that turns into a steamroller, they can essentially get away with undermining and destroying democracy. Now, nobody, for example, nobody can stop Bukele in El Salvador has like 80 or 90% support. But it's not that easy for a populist leader to get such overwhelming mass support. And what I highlight in my research and in my book is there are essentially, it depends on largely given exogenous conjunctural opportunities that enable some populist leaders to boost their mass support, whereas others who don't have those opportunities can't do it. Now, interestingly, those opportunities come in 2 kind of opposite versions, 2 opposite types. One is a massive resource windfall that in the case of Hugo Chavez and similar Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa, they got from the global commodities boom. So you have oil exporting countries, the government has control over the oil industry during the global commodities boom. These populist leaders had enormous revenues with which they could roll out generous social programs, they could buy off business people through juicy contracts, they could buy off politicos by allowing them to steal and be corrupt. And so the bonanza that they were gifted by the global commodities boom enabled them to get massive support. And you can see that Hugo Chavez wasn't all that popular in the first years of his government. 2003, 2004, the global commodities boom, his popularity very substantially increased and he was essentially unstoppable. So that's one factor. And that is interestingly the decisive factor that enables left-wing populists in Latin America to destroy democracy. And you see the logic here, because left-wingers want to improve the situation of the people. They want to bring mass prosperity. They want to lift people out of poverty. They want to diminish inequality. If you have this massive resource windfall, you can do this kind of thing. And so you see the logic that this condition, enormous resource windfall, helps left-wing populists to destroy and strangle democracy. Now, the opposite type of conjunctural opportunity, which in some sense is more paradoxical, is acute, severe, but resolvable crises. And what you see there is essentially what operates is the mechanism of loss aversion, which is a basic human motivation. So if a country, think of an example of an acute and severe but resolvable crisis. One is hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is strictly defined as price increases above 50% per month. So when a country suffers from hyperinflation that imposes enormous costs on vast sectors of the population, they suffer big time. If a populist leader with his boldness and his determination to get the problem under control, if they actually manage to end hyperinflation, with which a drastic adjustment program you can do fairly easily, they are the miraculous savior of the people. And loss aversion induces people to give them vast support. So like Alberto Fujimori had very high support. Other presidents who managed to resolve hyperinflation had pretty high support. That factor is especially important for right-wing populists, because when you think of it, the main appeal of right-wingers is order and stability, restore order and stability. They benefit from crises. And so you see in the parliamentary systems of Europe, the condition that was decisive for Orban and Erdogan to destroy democracy, but not for Kaczynski, not for Mejia, not for Fico, not for a lot of other populists in Eastern Europe, was a sharp economic crisis. 2008, sharp crisis in Hungary. Orban gets elected with a supermajority, can pull full steam ahead. Erdogan, 2001, deep crisis in Turkey. Erdogan wins, and he can move ahead. Kaczynski, Poland is doing well. No big crisis, no big majority, and Kaczynski couldn't do it. So, in the parliamentary systems of Europe, economic crisis is the decisive factor, the additional necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy. Latin America, presidential systems of government, firmer checks and balances, more of a separation of power. One crisis isn't sufficient in the Latin American countries to enable a populist leader to destroy democracy. What you need in Latin America is in some sense even worse, even more extraordinary. It's the coincidence of two acute and severe but resolvable crises. Think of Latin America, not that common for right-wing populists to destroy democracy. It was Alberto Fujimori who, until Bukele, was the only Latin American president to manage that. And Fujimori did it because he ended both massive hyperinflation and he managed to decapitate the shining path guerrilla insurgency. So Fujimori resolved both a serious economic crisis and a serious public security crisis. And what the book does, the book has about 30 case studies of populist leaders And it does a systematic compare-contrast. And it can do that very nicely in the Latin American cases, because Fujimori, two crises that coincided, destroys democracy. Hyperinflation and a big public security challenge. Carlos Menem in Argentina, hyperinflation, he got high support, he got one re-election, and then term over, you're out. One crisis wasn't sufficient. Hyperinflation alone doesn't do it. Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, public security challenge. He made good headway. He had high support. He got one re-election. Next re-election, you're out. He couldn't run again. And so you see one crisis. Fujimori, both hyperinflation and public security crisis, you resolve them, you move forward, and nobody can stop you. Menem, one crisis can't do it. Uribe, one crisis can't do it. Presidents who didn't face a big crisis or couldn't resolve a crisis couldn't do it. And so the only other case where right-wing populists in Latin America destroyed democracy is Bukele, because he benefited both from COVID and he was surprisingly effective in getting COVID under control and limiting the damage. And of course, he's benefited from a big public security crisis, the brutal stranglehold of gang crime over the population. Bukele made serious headway against both of those crises. He has 80–90% support. Nobody stops him, and he destroys democracy. But what you see is this: it's not that easy for populist leaders to destroy democracy. It depends on the coincidence of two types of necessary condition: institutional weakness and special conjunctural opportunity. And what that means, in the 1.5 minutes that I have left, what that means is advanced industrialized countries don't have to worry very much. Donald Trump was an autocrat. Donald Trump wants to destroy American democracy. Institutionally speaking, he made very little headway in his first government, and I predict during his second government, which is unfortunately likely, he will make very little headway again. People are worried about Marine Le Pen, about Geert Wilders, about they're not going to do much damage to democracy. I mean, Berlusconi in Italy was the only populist leader for a long time who held government office in a Western European country. According to Freedom House, the quality of Italian democracy improved during his government. Why? Because the opposition mobilized more participation. They reined him in, and Berlusconi, who was in government for about like a total of 10 years, 3 terms as prime minister, really didn't do much damage to democracy in Italy at all. So the people of the United States or Western Europe, you can sleep tight. Latin America, Eastern Europe, more trouble. And the book in the conclusion also talks about 4 of the Asian countries, and it tries to provide an overview. And the basic message is what is in the little circle down here: countering global alarmism. There has been too much alarmism about populism, how democracies die, and black cover, and everybody are like really worried. It is a problem. It is a threat. I'm not trying to downplay the threat, but it's not as bad. Democracy is stronger, more resilient. People cling to it, people defend it, and democracy has way more capacity to survive the challenge of populism than I think people have, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very cogent, elegant, and also empirically very rich assessment that gives us a framework to think about the democratic resilience at the interstices of optimism and alarmism. I'm not sure that a 17.5% success rate is something that I find entirely reassuring, especially when it's combined with a universal will to destroy democracy on the part of the populace. That seems to be a constant across all of the cases that you mentioned. But I do hope you're right. And now we'll turn to Dr. Nord.
I hope it works this time. Can you see my screen? Okay, finally. All problems happen unexpectedly as usually. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like to base my current presentation on the most recent democracy report that we produced at the Vidum Institute, and I called it Global Trends for Democracy and Autocracy, to really see how much changes there are in the world. So this year's democracy report is called Democracy Winning and Losing at the Ballot. And winning because we have cases like Brazil, but we also have cases where democracy clearly loses. And that corresponds also to this year of elections, super year of elections. So where we are in terms of democracy in the world. So if you look by country-based averages, we are back to 1998. But this is, if you see by the confidence intervals, there overlap and there is some uncertainty about that. But if you look by population-weighted averages, and that is how much democracy there is in the world for the average global citizen, then we are back to 1985. And we also looked at some averages, also territory-weighted averages and GDP-weighted average, and you see a similar picture. And that means that democracy is regressing. So we in Democracy Report, we quite often focus on population-weighted averages because we think of democracy as the rule by the people, and that means it matters how much democracy it is for the average person in the world. So if you look at this perspective, and then since 2009, and that is almost 15 years in a row, then the share of people living in autocratizing countries has overshadowed the share living in democratizing countries. If you look in terms of democracies and autocracies, there is a simplified version. You can take the same liberal democracy index and electoral democracy index that we use in VDOM and create a simplified picture in terms of autocracies and democracies in the world. And there you see that, like in simplified terms, you have 4 different types of regimes. And then, of course, there are some overlaps in terms of gray zone, what we call, this is when confidence intervals overlap, making the classification more uncertain. But some of those parts are very large boxes. So you have like large of electoral autocracy box and electoral democracy. And this is just to get the grasp, very simplified version of what is happening in the world. And if you look at this perspective, then you see that since early 70s, the share of democracies were increasing and electoral democracies until approximately early 2000, and then it started to decrease. And by the same time, if you look in 1973, there were 87 closed autocracies, and then they were decreasing for quite a long period of time. But at a certain point of time, they started to increase again. Here, if you look for the last 10 years only, then you see that the number of closed autocracies has recently become even larger than the number of liberal democracies. At the same time, we see that the number of electoral democracies is, for example, increasing, but that is largely due to the fact that liberal democracies are downgrading. You can look at the same picture looking only on population-weighted averages, and there you see that the share of people living in autocratic countries is increasing, and that is happening mostly during the last 20 years. So that's partly, half of that is, of course, the downgrading and autocratization in India, but there are also other large countries. So again, comparing to the last 20-year perspective, you see that 20 years ago, we had roughly half of the world population living in autocracies, and right now, by population weight, it is 71% of people in the world lived in autocracies. And if you look which aspects are getting worse, then what we do, we look at middle indices. This is sub-indices that go into democracy, aggregated democracy index. And then you see this is for 2013. And if you are above the line, that means that things are getting worse. And you see that almost all of them were above the line. That means that things were getting better for countries in 2013. But if you look now for 2023, almost all of them are down. And most affected here are freedom of expression and clean elections. Those are the, in these countries, you see that freedom of expression is declining in 35 countries, where improving in only 12. And for clean elections, it's declining in 23 countries and improving in 12. And this, the same perspective, if you look at very indicators that go into aggregate indices, and we have 600 different indicators, and what we do, we basically calculate which one of them are declining substantially and statistically significant, and take the top 10. And if you're above the red line, it is top 20, and if you're above the red line, it is top 10. So you see that the most declining indicators, this is freedom of expression and elections this year. So this means, and then you see that countries that are declining the most, this is 45, above 40, and that means that those are the aspects that are attacked the most, and probably the aspects that are attacked the first when countries starts to autocratize. In terms of regime change, we identify that there are 60 countries in episodes of regime change across different regions this year. And here is the map, and you see that they're spread over the world. So if you have shades of red and orange, that means that things are getting worse. If you have shades of blue, that things are getting better. In terms of population, this is the same perspective. If you're below the line, things are getting worse. If you're above the line, things are getting better. And the purpose of showing this is that you see that like below the line are mostly large countries, except for Brazil and Thailand that you see like all large countries. So this is the reason why we so much look by population weighted average and democracy level. A number of autocratizing and democratizing countries in the world. Here again, the last 50 years. And you see that since 1973 until mid-90s, there were a lot more countries that were democratizing. And in 1992, you have 70 countries that were democratizing at the same time. And that was the time when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. So we thought that this is. And after that, the number of countries democratizing started to decline. And at the same time, this is something that we identified since 1994. That was the start of the third wave of autocratization. So the last approximately 20 years, we see that things are getting worse. So. And in terms of share of world population living in autocratizing countries, 20 years ago it was only 7, and right now it is 1/3 of the world. And in numbers, it was 11 countries 20 years ago, and now it is 42. And important story here is that like 42 countries that are now autocratizing, 28 of them were democracies at the start of their episode. And out of those 28, only 15 remain democracies in 2023. What we do this year is we distinguish between autocratization episodes that are standalone, that means that they start in a regime that was relatively stable, and so-called bout-on autocratization that you can think about it as failed democratization. So those are countries that were democratizing, but at some point democratization failed and turned into autocratization. So standalone autocratization, those are countries like Hungary, Greece, Poland, India. So the important point here, so you see the line that we try to, show here the year. This is the pre-episode year, this is before they started, and where they are in 2023. And the important thing to figure, those are top 10, and like at the beginning 8 out of 10 were democracies, and right now 8 out of 10 autocracies. So in terms of bout-on autocratization, you can see those are cases of failed democratization. So you hear that everything those changes happen in all spectrum of a liberal democracy index. So you see cases like South Korea, but you also at the bottom you see cases like Myanmar that were improving at a certain point of time, but then reversed, or Haiti. And in terms of an important point here is also that like 5 out of those 10 cases during the last 10 years were mentioned as top 10 democratizers. So cases like Armenia, for example. And this is where the process of democratization was reversed. And again, we see the same story here that, again, freedom of expression and the media are attacked, but also elections are now increasingly under attack. And this is something new because usually this is the core institution of democracy that usually comes late at a stage during autocratization. We also have good news, some democratizing countries, and this year we have 18 of them, but again, compared to 20 years ago, there are less. So 20 years ago, there were only 35. And it is only 5% of the world's population. And Brazil is the largest of those cases, and it makes more than half of these. Again, we distinguish cases as standalone and U-turns. Standalone are mostly smaller countries like Seychelles, for example. It's one of those top democratizers of the last 10 years. But here, again, this is the reason why we so much focus on population-weighted average, because, of course, we're very much happy for what is happening in Seychelles, but like Seychelles is a tiny island with 90,000 population, but then at the same time you have India that is autocratizing with 1.4 billion people, and for the world, India, of course, means a lot more than Seychelles. The most interesting case, I think, for this story would be also democratizing countries, so so-called U-turn democratization. So these are cases where autocratization process was halted and reversed. One of them is Brazil, and we identified this year ongoing cases. There are 9 of them that are now reversing, but there are also cases like Thailand, cases that we wrote about last year like Zambia and Maldives. And here we at some point we started to do research more focused on those cases of U-turns where autocratization were reversed. And what we did, we identified all cases of U-turns since 900, since the beginning of the 20th century. And what we see is that on average, during the last 125 years, 48% of all autocratization cases are eventually reversed. And if you look at the last 30 years at cases that have already stopped, 70% are actually turnaround, coming back to at least the same level of democracy that was there before autocratization started. And 93% actually get back either the same level or even above the same level that was. So that shows some I would say some sign of hope, because it means that democracy is in fact a lot more resilient than we support. And just to make sure that it's not only, when we call autocratization cases, we mean not only cases that start in democracies, but any kind of movement from democracy to autocracy. So it may also start in autocracy and just becoming more autocratic and then reversal. And this is something we had in the last year democracy report. We looked in detail at some of those cases, those what we called democracies bouncing back, and we tried to identify which aspects helped to reverse those cases. And that was very quick and dirty analysis, so it's not like a proper research analysis, but just to give a sense of what was happening in those cases and why they reversed. And so we identified 5 elements. One element was large-scale popular mobilization, and that is stories like South Korea, so really like millions of people going to the streets and protesting against autocratization. Then also judicial independence, and it was something that about the strengths of institutions that has already been mentioned by Kurt. So this is something where the judiciary stood up. So they did not allow something what Nancy Burnell called executive aggrandizement. So this was something where judicial independence was really important, the strengths of institutions. Then there was also unified opposition and opposition strategies against autocratization. Then there were also critical elections or other critical events. So this is critical points in time around which actors could unite and coordinate their actions. And of course, there was also international democracy support. That was less important in many cases, but at least we could find some signs that they were important in other cases. So that is also something that probably we should do proper research on. And the last part of the report, and I probably go very, very quickly about it, is the year of elections. So this is very quickly, if you look at all countries that are holding elections this year, we see that 31 of them are declining on democracy index and only 3 of them are improving. And out of those 3 are actually, all 3 are U-turn cases. That means that they were autocratizing during the last years and they're only reversing the trend of autocratization. And so in total, you have this picture where actual elections will be held in rather like at least half of those elections will be held in countries that are already declining on democracy index. I think that's something that's important because elections are very critical events that could either help to stabilize autocratic regimes or to turn things around. Yeah, thank you. And this is where I end.
Thank you so much for this incredibly rich and rigorous global picture that is also dynamic, and we see diachronic trends that inspire dismay, as well as trends that are really interesting food for thought in connection with Professor Whelan's arguments about democratic resilience and the possibility of U-turns. As well as specification of a number of critical sort of enabling conditions or mechanisms that spur countries to go in one or another direction. So very, very rich indeed. And we already have, in fact, I also want to thank you for being very timely in your comments. That was really an amazing amount of content that you've lucidly shared with us. Now we have several questions in the boxes or in the chat box, and because Professor Bacchus may have to leave early, I'm going to ask him the first question, which is also the first posed, and it regards the possible or probable election of Donald Trump, re-election of Donald Trump to the White House, and how it may impact some of the key themes upon which Professor Bacchus spoke about. So the intersection with kind of more meaningful re-enlivening of democratic traditions through popular engagement, and also how that connects with sustainability and climate change. These are key elements of your remarks. How does the possible return of Donald Trump to the White House impact those dynamics?
Thank you for the question, and thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. The fact that I'm an optimist causes me to hope that Professor Whelan is right about what would transpire in the aftermath of the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and should he be elected, I'm going to do everything I can personally to try to make certain that Professor Whelan is right. I'm not quite as sanguine as he seems to be about the resilience at this point of our democratic institutions in the United States. And I'm also gravely concerned about what the impact would be of the return to the White House of Donald Trump on our international institutions. First of all, in terms of globalization, I think you could see from the second Trump administration a fierce and foolish return to really very aggressive protectionism. What we've seen under President Biden is polite protectionism. Basically, the Trump policy from Trump's first term without the insults. President Biden is a good and decent man, and he doesn't think it's a particularly good idea to insult our friends and allies in the world. Donald Trump sees things differently. But if you look at what Trump has proposed in terms of an economic policy internationally in his second term, and if you look at what both the Democrats and the Republicans are embracing in their own policies, I fear we could see an unraveling of the world trading system beyond what we've already seen. I believe Trump would, at this point, go ahead with his previous promise to try to withdraw from the WTO, and I don't see the United States standing up forthrightly as an affirmative leader in other international economic institutions. In terms of the rule of law, Donald Trump doesn't care about the rule of law. I think the domestic test will be whether we Americans care about the rule of law sufficiently to prevent him from undermining it domestically. But we're already seeing the undermining of the rule of law internationally, given what's happened under the Biden administration. And I think we can see even worse forthcoming, excuse me, from the Trump administration, should there be a second one. The view of international law that the Trump thinkers have is that international law is useful only when it seems to serve our selfish ends. Otherwise, we can safely ignore it. In terms of human rights, don't get me started, both domestically and internationally. I see a second Trump administration not only is not standing up for human rights, but is undermining it. I've been thinking about Professor Whalen said, and I have just ordered his new book. I've read his previous books and look forward to this one. I recall when, and I'll conclude with this, I could recall when Octavian, 2,000 years ago, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, changing his name to Augustus. He did not abolish the Roman Republic. He kept all the trappings and the semblances of the Roman Republic in place, but he made them into a fiction. And he had the sole authority in Rome. I think that's more likely to be the direction of the Trump administration. Next time around, when he'll be shorn of what he thought was the need to seem more or less respectable at the outset of his first try at the presidency, we'll see whether Americans will permit him to do that. I certainly hope that he won't win the election, and I hope that we won't stand for that type of autocratic behavior if he becomes president again. Thank you again all so very much. And pardon my coughing. I have a bit of a cold.
Thank you so much for this historical and yet timely, given that it was just recently the 15th of March and the Ides of March, which remind us of the assassination of Julius Caesar. So not only can we draw insight from our contemporary comparative global perspective, but also from a sort of a broad intertemporal analysis of how populists assert power across time and space. I'm going to interpolate between the those who have their hands up and the chat box. So I'm going to give the floor now to Irina von Wies, and then I'll go back to the chat box and then come back to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nora, and particularly thank you to this excellent panel. I am very obviously heartened by Professor Weiland's optimism. However, I have a question regarding one factor that I think you mentioned only in fading, and that is the impact of our climate emergency and the resulting global population movements that we are inevitably going to see. Now, as you may know, not only in the United Kingdom, but across the world, and notably in the United States, migration is used by populists and possibly as their number one argument for particularly national right-wing populism. And I don't personally see how over the course of the next years, possibly decades, unless we find some miraculous turnaround in our environmental policy, how this is going to get any better. So I would welcome your views on how you think the climate emergency and migration is going to impact on populism and the resulting problems. Thank you.
So in my view, clearly migration is one of the main arguments that populist leaders use to win power, especially in what you would call Western democracies, the United States and Western Europe, because migration patterns go first and foremost and kind of in the most striking way, also based on the biggest difference in people who move and the recipient country to the, call them advanced industrialized Western countries. Now, according to my argument, those countries benefit from a great deal of institutional stability, and they benefit from a comparatively limited degree of economic and social volatility. And so my prediction would be that migration helps populist leaders to get elected to office, like Trump or, who knows, Marine Le Pen or Geert Wilders, all these people. But when they're in office, institutional strength and resilience and the comparatively limited volatility of economies and societies won't give them the necessary conditions to seriously undermine or destroy democracy. I think all these Western countries have long consolidated democracies. Checks and balances are comparatively firm, where you have parliamentary systems and checks and balances are institutionally attenuated. You have often very strong independent judiciaries. In addition, you have vibrant, resourceful civil societies. The other thing is, when you look at the conditions, Western countries have very diversified economies and a lot of fiscal capacity. So that means they're not going to benefit from a huge revenue windfall. There is not a single sector like, oil in Venezuela that can just flood the country with petrodollars. And they're not that subject to really profound and acute crises. You see, for example, when COVID hit, the United States, even the liberal United States, did so much compensatory spending that allegedly average incomes actually increased during the COVID pandemic. So even if there is a sudden tremendous shock, these countries have the capacity to make up for it and not expose large sectors of the population to the terrible losses of something like hyperinflation. And so I would say that migration will benefit populist leaders in coming to office, but it will not enable and allow them to then use their attributions and power in office in order to undermine and strangle democracy. I still think that the Western countries are quite safe. And one additional point I wanted to make, in a historical perspective, because we talk about historical perspectives, one thing that hardened my view about the resilience of democracy. So my last book was about the interwar years. And of course, the great book by Agnes Cornell and Jürgen Möller and Sven-Erik Skarning that looks at the interwar years and emphasizes that none of the established democracies were done in by communism and fascism. The interwar years were much more troubled, much more crisis-ridden, much more turbulent than the contemporary period. And even during that time, consolidated democracies uniformly survived. And so, sort of by implication, I think the current troubles, which are significant, but not nearly as severe as during the interwar years, are not going to do in the United States or Holland or France or the consolidated democracies of what we would call the West. So.
Thank you so much for this thoughtful and sort of historically important, but also very much grounded assessment in sort of rationalist institutionalist claims. It does, of course, raise the question of one of your the sufficient part of the necessary sufficient conditions, which is the need for the ability for populists to position themselves as saviors in times of crisis. And so, your arguments are very to point when we think about materialist institutionalist forces at play. Of course, there's cultural dynamics at play in the capacity within the new media environment to manufacture crises and to cultivate emotions that may or may not correspond with the material features which you're describing. So in that context, maybe if I just raising that thought and invite you to also address one of the questions which asks, in a European context where we have multiple elections on the horizon that may lead to the rise of populists who do indeed manufacture crises regarding migration and other other elements of the culture wars. Do you have any examples of how we might counteract these more sort of culturally packaged forms of populist provocation?
So if I can respond briefly in two ways. First, in my view and based on my research, the claim that populists can manufacture crises, which especially Benjamin Moffitt made in his 2016 book, I think is exaggerated. I think there's always a margin of maneuver, a margin of exaggerating, politicizing, emphasizing, dramatizing, and all these kinds of things. But according to my research, I mean, people feel whether there is a real crisis. And crisis is one of these overused terms. Everything is a crisis. I mean, there are millions of crises out there. For crisis to have any analytical bite, we have to have a fairly clear definition. So like hyperinflation. And when you look at this, I mean, a real crisis seriously hurts and threatens large numbers of the population indirectly, like hyperinflation, or think of the gang crime in El Salvador. Allegedly, people couldn't leave their house without paying protection money to a gang. That hurts and bites you every day in your daily life. You can play up migration and it's an invasion and whatever. How does it hurt me in my daily life? I mean, people in Texas, they hire migrants, including illegal migrants, to mow their lawn and take care of their babies. I mean, this is not like that they have to pay protection to migrants who camp out in their front yard, right? So this is a very different kind of thing. And you can play it up and you can exaggerate it, but it doesn't have nearly the same kind of impact. The second thing is just to, how should I say that? It might be controversial, but I think on that migration issue, I think mainstream parties are well advised to go the path of Danish social democracy or what Sweden is doing now. I think you have to accommodate the concerns of a large segment of the people that is concerned about migration. I'm a migrant, I benefit from migration. So this is not my personal view, but I think in a democracy, if in the United States or in the Netherlands or in France, if 20, 30, 40% of the population are concerned about migration and push for limiting it, I think democratic competition in a simple Downsian model will advise some accommodation of that, not in terms of the culture war and all the rhetoric, whatever, but I think especially giving that part of the population some kind of idea that the government is in control. I think what especially bothers people and what drives them into the arms of populists is the sense that this is a uncontrollable, in Trumpian terms, invasion, and that illegal migrants overrun the country. And so I think mainstream parties are well advised to do whatever they can to contain and limit migration, and especially to move it from illegal entry to going through the legal channels. And, as I say, it might be controversial. There's a lot of debate, and I'll be legitimating what these populists do. Democracy means if a large segment of the population holds certain views, parties are advised, at least some, to accommodate that and move in that direction. Simple kind of Downsian logic. So.
Thank you for that. And I will now give the floor to Albina
Azmanova. Yes, thank you. I agree with much of what Professor Wailard has said. However, we seem to be assuming that there is a democracy that is being threatened, while it might be just the opposite, that our ailing democracies generated populism as a reaction to the failure of democracy. You might remember there was a study by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page about 10 years ago, a very good research, two professors, established researchers, claiming that was the oligarchy report, establishing that the US is not a democracy, but an oligarchy where economic and social policy is decided by organized groups and policy political elites representing, you know, big business. So it just struck me how we are talking as if there is this healthy democracy where they're, you know, to protect from populism. So it seems to me that unless we address the policies that these oligarchic liberal regimes have put in place and generated mass precarity. And in my book, Capitalism on Edge, I established that populism is a reaction to this massive precarization of the population that neoliberal globalization has generated. So unless we, unless these drivers of populism within our liberal oligarchies are addressed, there is no chance for for stopping the far-right populism. This is what
so this is a,
can I just was the question for Professor Wayland?
That the very premise of the study of whether populism poses danger to democracy presupposes that democracy is this healthy thing that is being endangered, while it has been in fact ailing, and that failure of democracy is the reason of the rise of populism.
May I? I'm not sure who you addressed the question to, and I would invite all of the panelists to think about this really interesting statement that I believe also Kasmude and Cristobal have formulated of populism as being endemic to democracy and reflective of what you've brilliantly called sort of the oligarchic liberal discontents. And so I wanted to ask if in your respective, you have the three panelists have these fantastic recent research outputs. So, across the two books and the reports that Dr. Nord also invoked, do you see evidence for this, this angle on the problem of looking at populism as endemic to democratization and to democracy? And if we turn the lens that way, does that change in any way our prescriptions for how to grapple with the populist challenge? But I would like to give the floor to Dr. Nord to engage with this first, because there was a lot of causal mechanisms and enabling conditions that she discussed in her data. And so perhaps she has some insights from that very large databases, and then to Professor Wayland and Professor Bacchus, both of whom also, of course, have written important new books on this topic.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment a little bit. When we talk about autocratization, for some reason, people think that we are talking about democracies, only democracies declining and becoming autocracies. When we look at data, what we actually see is that a lot of autocratization happens in countries that are already autocratic, and they become even more autocratic. So if you look at countries like Turkey, Russia, Hungary, which has already been classified for autocracy for quite some time. So if we distinguish, it may be a little bit misleading what I present, because we always look at the top 10 countries. If you look at the top 10 countries, of course, you will have a couple of democracies over there. And since they kind of declined, even at Hungary or whatever, they started at such a high point that eventually the decline is, the magnitude of change is so large that they end up being on the top 10. But in terms of data, countries in the top 20-30% are more or less stable. I mean, a large portion of the world is actually stable. So of course we have like autocratization happening in countries like Greece, but again, among liberal democracies, Greece is rather an exception. So I would say that I don't see any contradiction to what, for example, Professor Wieland presented here, because if we are talking only about democracies experience decline, then this is one story. But if we talk about autocratization as such in general, then this is a very, very alarming topic for countries that are already autocratic. So countries like Russia would be an example where you become even more and more autocratic, and countries like Myanmar and all that. So I think that is something that like we should keep in mind. So we are not talking about democracies autocratizing only, but we are talking about all spectrum of regimes from autocracies to democracies, and then autocratization is any movement towards becoming like more autocratic.
Professor Bacchus, do you have any thoughts?
My thought is that Professor Asmanova is largely right. And the fact is, we've failed, at least in my country, over the past 30 years to do what is needed to be done to make certain that ordinary Americans are able to continue to prosper and to feel that they have a future. I'm all in favor of free trade, for example, but we have done very little in this country to make certain that the benefits from trade are enjoyed by all Americans. Too many of the benefits have gone just to the people at the top. This is a domestic issue. It's not a reason to abandon trade. It's a reason to do what we need to do domestically. And as I said at the outset, I believe that our democracy needs to be much more participatory. In this, I go back to my youth. During the 60s and 70s, when a lot of us were saying that, and I've said it all along, even as I've served in various positions of responsibility and governance. I don't think we have what can rightly be called the best form of democracy in our country or in most of the West. And of course, as I've already mentioned, there are a lot of pretend democracies in the world. And ask China, and they would say, well, yes, we're a democracy too. It says so right in our Constitution. But, looking at what we actually have, I would go back here, not to the Romans, but to the ancient Athenians. Their democracy had plenty of shortcomings. Women weren't allowed to participate. Immigrants weren't allowed to participate. And, oh yes, they had a whole lot of slaves who also were not allowed to participate. But if you were a citizen, you were permitted to participate in a direct democracy. Amazing for that time. And if the Greeks, if those Athenian citizens were to look at our American democracy today, they would say exactly what Professor Asmanova has said, that it's an oligarchy. There are reasons for this. The antiquated structure of our political systems, such as the Electoral College, gerrymandering, unlimited political spending, increasingly undisclosed. There are many, many reasons for this, but I have to say that the end result is that it's an oligarchy in which there are two competing parties that, to varying extents and in different ways, are indebted to that oligarchy.
All right, thank you for this analogy and this inside-out eye from intertemporal perspective, how the ancient Greeks.
I recommend her book to everyone. It's quite good. So,
Thank you. And Professor Wayland, look forward to your response, bearing in mind we have one more question in the audience, and you've also been asked by one of the participants in the chat box to weave in an engagement of Dr. Nord's ideas as well, if it's possible to fold that in. We have about 5 minutes left, so if you could share your thoughts, and then time permitting, we'll take one last question, and then we'll wrap the session.
So very briefly, I see, how to say, I use a very conventional definition of democracy. And so I think what you have in mind is problems of democratic quality. And clearly representation deficits have an impact on the electoral chances of populists. Of course, the paradox is that if you're worried about oligarchy, a number of the populists who have been elected are the biggest oligarchs of all, like Trump or Berlusconi or Babiš in the Czech Republic. And of course, they come with the promise of empowering the people, and they never empower the people. They always empower themselves. So if populism is a response to problems of democracy, it certainly makes the problems worse and not better. The fact that besides oligarchy, I think what is in some sense a more underlying problem in modern democracies that will create, I think, increasing space for populists is technocracy, because the modern world is so complicated and problems are so difficult that mainstream politicians come with 1,000-page-long bills and people don't understand. And you have an issue like immigration in the United States, which hasn't been resolved in like 30 years. And here come Trump and say, easy, build the wall. And so that gap between people's understanding of the tremendous complexity of the world and the simplistic solutions of populism, I think, will provide increasing room for populists to come to power in the future. I think that's one of my main concerns in a long-term perspective.
All right, well, let's have the last question to Anna Ben-Amara. Please identify who you're addressing the question to.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's not really a question. It's just a follow-up comment on what Dr. Albena and Professor, I think he left us, Pukek, something like that. Sorry, I don't remember the full name. But yes, so you were speaking about American democracy, and since its very foundation, the American political system and American democracy has been subject to extensive criticism. So since the Declaration of Independence, we hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And by that time, all men, it did not include like women, it did not include the poor, it did not include African Americans, slaves, of course. But here, the fact that American democracy is an elitist democracy cannot be denied, and this distrust towards the mob through the Electoral College and through the different policies that have been introduced throughout history, cannot be denied actually. Another just follow-up comment on the fact that populism was historically positive. I would not actually say that, but historically speaking, we can consider populism as an empty signifier, a concept that can be filled with different meanings, different concepts, different interpretations. But this concept, historically speaking, was or did contain this nativist element. And for example, let's take the case of Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan was one of the most, let's say, unfamous populist leaders in the history of the United States. So he was actually the speechwriter of Nixon, and he was the electoral candidate for the 1992 electoral campaign. And Patrick Buchanan was a replica of Donald Trump. But by the time, he appeared in the 1990s, people were still influenced by the ecstasy of the New World Order and the liberal market capitalism. So, his ideas of nationalism, nativism were not influential. And, he even wrote a book entitled The Death of the West, in which was very shocking, to the audience of Fukuyama at that time, and the post, Soviet order, America and American civilization.
Thank you, Amna. Could you maybe sum it up?
Yeah,
We're
sure.
out of time.
Sure. So the point is that populism was not something that is positive, historically speaking, and it wasn't, and it hasn't been something like new. So it has been under the surface, let's say, for decades, but now the stage has been set for populist leaders to thrive and to appear and to be actually influential and known at the public and at the international level. So that's the point.
Thank you so much. So I think that's a fitting note on which to close. We have populism and there's an empty signifier, but we've had 3 presentations that have populated, as it were, that empty signifier with immense empirical and analytical richness. And I think we've all learned a great deal from this conversation. So I would just like to applaud the contributors. And I believe we did lose Dr. Bacchus, but he will hopefully hear our applause on his way to the airport. So thank you so much. And thank you also again to the organizers. And I'll turn the floor over to Ibrahim Öztürk now.
Thank you very much for all those insightful, comprehensive contributions, discussions. With your great contributions, we have successfully came to the end of our first day in our program. But please note that we have 2 more wonderful panel discussion tomorrow. For those who have time, we would like to see you together with us and continue our discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good evening, good night, good morning.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Well done.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
See you.